In 2014, it's 300 years since George I and his family arrived in Britain to begin the Georgian era. This was the age in which modern Britain as we know it would be formed.
Why should we care about these Georgians? They didn't give us the industry of the Victorians or the sensational head chopping of Henry VIII. But they did champion the idea of liberty and make Britain a more open society, one in which satire flourished and a new form of expression was invented, the novel.
Bizarrely, this Georgian age that seems so quintessentially British actually has a story beginning here, in Hanover, in northern Germany.
As outsiders, the first German Georges were able to be modernisers. It was on their watch that cabinet government first emerged. For this series, I've been given access to the Royal Collection, as pieces are brought together for an exhibition at the Queen's Gallery, Buckingham Palace, telling the story of the first Georges through artworks they commissioned or owned.
We tend to think of the Georgian era in terms of the madness of George III, or the heroines of Jane Austen. But I think the key to it all lies right at the start, in the reigns of the first two Georgian kings.
Under George I and George II, Britain became the world's most liberal and cosmopolitan society. We owe so much to these German kings who made Britain. In 1701, Britain faced a big problem. The heir to the throne, Princess Anne, had failed to provide the royal family's next generation. She'd gone through 17 pregnancies in a desperate attempt to produce an heir. But her last surviving son had just died. Parliament took drastic action. They had the idea of importing a ready-made royal family from overseas.
This is one of the most important documents in the whole history of the British monarchy. This is the piece of parchment that changed history. It's the Act of Settlement from 1701 that sets out who can, and importantly, who can't be king or queen. First of all, you've got to have some Stuart blood. You've got to be related either to the late Queen Mary or to Princess Anne. But trumping that, you've got to be a Protestant. As it says here, if you profess the Popish religion or marry a Papist, you shall be excluded.
This act came into force as a result of what Protestants called the Glorious Revolution. This was when James II was chucked off the throne for his Roman Catholic sympathies and his belief in the divine right of kings. James II was now in exile in France, but with the British Protestant royal line dying out, Parliament needed to find a new ruler who wasn't Catholic. Who should rule next?
So now the Protestant aristocracy of England have to look back up the Stuart family tree in search of a Protestant heir. We go through James II, Charles II, Charles I. We get right back up to James I. And through his daughter Elizabeth, we find here Sophia.
Electress Sophia of Hanover is pivotal in the history of the British monarchy. She was the next Protestant in the royal Stuart line.
That looks quite simple, but it wasn't. Queen Anne had actually had no less than 50 nearer relatives than Sophia, who were all passed over on the grounds that regrettably, but unacceptably, they were
Sophia was the matriarch of a princely family who ruled the remote German territory of Hanover. But now she was first in line to the British throne.
Sophia forms part of a very German tradition of royal women leading the social and the intellectual life of a court. Very unlike the British tradition, where we have the badly educated princesses Mary and Anne, who were dull as ditch water. In her statue, Sophia is holding a book by her personal friend, the philosopher Leibniz. And she and Leibniz exchanged many, many letters discussing questions like the nature of the human soul. As well as Peter the Great of Russia, it was said that Louis XIV himself was in love with her brilliance.
Sophia was thrilled about her new status and was desperate to come to London. But Queen Anne didn't want a rival queen, particularly one who was a whole lot cleverer, showing her up in her own kingdom. Sophia just had to sit and wait for Anne to die.
So why have you never heard of Queen Sophia I of Great Britain? She would have been very good at the job. She was intelligent and rational. She was tolerant and enlightened. But very unluckily, just 2 months before Queen Anne died, Sophia was out here in the gardens, and it was during a thunderstorm that she drops down dead. It's rather melancholy being here in her boudoir and thinking about Sophia, the greatest queen we never had.
Sophia did not die in vain. Her descendants would inherit the British crown. It was her eldest son, Georg Ludwig, who was to become King George I of Great Britain. Unlike his mother, he was uncharismatic, not particularly impressive, and he already had enemies. Without the Act of Settlement, George's distant cousin, the Catholic James Stuart, would have become King James III. He was in exile in France. Although he was only 13 years old, he was already plotting how to get his crown back. So, when George arrived to start his new life as King of England and Scotland, he was getting into a pretty tricky situation. He sailed up the River Thames and landed here at Greenwich, but he didn't exactly receive a royal welcome. There was a mix-up. The crowd that had gathered mistook George's son for their new king. So when George himself disembarked, the spectators had sort of dribbled away. George's new kingdom really was new. The splicing together of England and Scotland had only taken place 7 years previously. Things were unstable. If I was a gambler, I wouldn't have put much money on the survival of this Hanoverian dynasty. George I was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 20th of October, 1714. All the great and good of Protestant Britain were in attendance. This is the actual crown that George wore 300 years ago. It doesn't have any real jewels in it, because George, being frugal, rented them. And look at the great big cross on the top. It was George's Protestant religion that had put him on the throne. And in this coronation, for the first time, a copy of the Bible in English, a key text of the Protestant Reformation, was carried in the procession. But poor old George's English language skills weren't his strongest point. You can't blame him, it was after all his fourth language. Unfortunately though, it was now the language of his new subjects, and he couldn't really speak it very well. He couldn't understand what was happening in the ceremony. But nevertheless, the establishment were delighted. One spectator said that the sight of the coronation brought tears to her eyes. They felt that everything was safe now, their liberty, their property, and their religion. But the coronation was preaching to the converted. To many of his newly Georgian subjects, the idea of being ruled by a German took some getting used to.
George's coronation at Westminster Abbey was slightly marred by xenophobia. Spectators were heard to call out, "Down with the German" and "Out with the foreigners." If you look at the popular protests against George at this time, there's quite a funny theme running throughout them. This idea that Hanover is a place full of yokels. In pamphlets, we see pictures of George hoeing a row of turnips. There's a song calling him Turnip Head. And I'm sorry to say that on the day of the coronation, one man was pulled out of the crowd for brandishing one of these. It's a turnip on a stick.
Of all the roots of Hanover, the turnip is the best. 'Tis his salad when 'tis raw, and his sweetmeat when 'tis dressed. Ben a hoeing, he may go, may go, may go, and his turnips he may hoe.
The turnip was a foreign vegetable that suggested George's German roots. Indeed, singing the turnip song became a popular way to protest against the new king. The Jacobites, supporters of the would-be King James III, loved it. It wasn't the most auspicious of starts, and the balance of power between king and parliament had shifted. Parliament thought that their new pet king ought to follow their rules and do what they wanted. The king wasn't even allowed to leave his new country without Parliament's permission.
George I was a lot less wealthy than some of his contemporary European counterparts. He just didn't have the cash to splash on palaces like Versailles. Parliament gave him just £700,000 a year, not enough to run a really big court. George quickly realised that he needed to work with Parliament and not against them. Some of his Stuart predecessors had been constantly head-to-head with Parliament in some very violent and destructive confrontations, insisting upon their divine right to rule. But George was much more conciliatory.
He had to be. Parliament had given the throne to George, and perhaps they would take it away from him. He was a monarch appointed not by God, but by men. Here at the Painted Hall in Greenwich is George's mission statement. It was his promise to the British to be the king they wanted. Desmond Shaw Taylor is surveyor of the Queen's pictures and an experienced decoder of Georgian art.
What was the aim of this big painting at the end?
It is to show the arrival of the Hanoverians as the fulfilment of the destiny of the Glorious Revolution. I think that's the idea.
So we've got William and Mary up here, and then Queen Anne.
And then on the end wall, on the sort of high altar, as it were, George I and his large family.
They are a race, aren't there? There's an huge number of them.
There are plenty of, there are lots of progeny, exactly. And I think that's an important part of the Hanoverian offer, as it were.
So talk me through who they all are. It starts with Sophia, the sort of matriarch of the dynasty.
Absolutely, yeah. There's the Electress Sophia of Hanover. Her son, George I, sits enthroned with his elbow firmly resting on the globe, designs for
expansion.
Yeah, a bit of expansion going on. And then his eldest son, George II, stands on his left-hand side.
And is it an accident that they're facing away from each other?
Well, it's certainly suggestive if it is an accident, because they didn't get on.
By contrast, the poor old Queen Anne sitting up all lonely in solitary splendour in the sky, no children at all.
The artist has absolutely exploited that to give a sense almost of homely reassurance to this new dynasty, particularly in the way that the grandchildren are presented playing around on the very steps as allegories of art and culture, yes, but also I think as the idea that a sort of uncomplicated domestic life. This is something which the new dynasty is bringing.
What are the differences between the Stuarts and the Hanoverians in the way they're depicted then?
Well, it may be just an accident of what space was available, but it seems as if the Hanoverians are bringing us right down to earth.
With a bump almost.
With a bump, exactly.
Here they are, face to face, shake hands.
The illusion, instead of the idea that the vault is open to the sky and you just sort of look up and wonder, the illusion is that there is a series of steps leading up from the high table to the throne upon which George I sits, so one can just walk up and meet him. And in fact, the artist himself, James Thornhill, is showing himself standing on that step, almost like a footman, pointing to the king, saying, go and talk to him, he's fine.
So it's not really a revolution, this, it's more of an evolution.
I think that's what they would like us to think.
This was a Georgian manifesto. The king wanted people to know that he was offering a very different proposition to those tyrannical, absolutist, pig-headed old Stuarts. George I set up home at Kensington Palace, and here on the stairs are portraits that he had painted of members of his household. Quite unusually, his lower servants are included. They were an international lot, and this caused trouble at court. The most infamous example relates to the king's supposed pair of mistresses, the elephant, the fat one, and the maypole, the ever so slightly thinner one.
The fat one, the elephant, was in fact the king's illegitimate half-sister, and he just had the one skinny mistress, the maypole. This reputation that George developed as a sort of deviant sexual athlete, in fact, came from the xenophobic British courtiers. The naughty Lord Chesterfield, for example, put it about that the king rejected no woman if she were very willing, very fat, and had great breasts, with the consequence that candidates for the position of royal mistress strained and swelled to put on weight. Some succeeded, and others burst. All of the foreigners close to the king came in for this sort of scurrilous sexual slander, including the king's 2 Turkish valets, seen here. This is Mustafa with the white beard, and Muhammad in the blue cloak. Muhammad was very close to the king. He helped him to get dressed in the mornings, and he even treated his hemorrhoids. And of course, gossip grew up about this. People said that the king keeps his Turks for abominable uses.
But these same aristocrats who criticised George behind his back were probably as keen as anybody to curry favour with the new regime. This even extended to copying George's taste. The new dynasty were early adopters of a brand new architectural style. It was the complete opposite to the fancy French showiness loved by the Stuarts. We can see the prototype round the back of Hampton Court Palace.
This looks like a little country house, but it isn't. It's a new kitchen added to Hampton Court by George I for his German cooks. They made his German sausages in there. This is the first building in Britain in the Neo-Palladian style. It's very stark and simple and symmetrical, not much external decoration. And the secret of its success lies in the harmony of the proportions, the relationship between the horizontal and the vertical. This style would catch on, and all over Georgian Britain you'd find country houses sprouting up that look just like this.
This was a new, orderly and rational way of seeing the world. And you just need to look at cities like Bath and Edinburgh to see that it would catch on. The inspiration was the 16th century architect Andrea Palladio, who'd recreated the works of the ancient Romans. Neo-Palladianism was ancient Rome brought back to life with an Anglo-Saxon twist. The Georgians were saying, Britons, we are the heirs to the power of Rome, and together we can build a new empire. An important promoter of this new style of Neo-Palladianism was Lord Burlington, a member of the king's inner circle. Burlington's own house at Chiswick is a magnificent example, as I'm shown by the architectural historian Carol Fry.
So Carol, tell me why this is a Neo-Palladian room that we're in.
Well, it picks up on Roman antique architecture. So everything about this room is referenced to an antique source. For example, the coffered ceiling is a direct replica of the Basilica of Maxentius in Rome. and we've got these very ornate pediments, and yet the room remains very cold and Spartan and very sparse, which was a trait of Neo-Palladian architecture.
Burlington was a tastemaker and a trendsetter. Chiswick was a Neo-Palladian masterpiece. But there was something else going on under the Georgian veneer.
There is some very questionable imagery in this building, treasonous imagery, which doesn't need to be here.
Treasonous imagery is hidden within this building, you're
Yes,
saying?
not hidden very well. It's there to be seen if you have eyes to see it. The painting up there of Charles I and his family, and he was a very great Stuart king, and that's hanging over that doorway directly in front of the door. So as soon as visitors would come in, they would see the old Stuart king hanging there. Not very Hanoverian.
These are the guys who are out of power. They've been exiled.
Absolutely.
And what's going on with the star that we're standing on?
Well, that's important because this is the Order of the Garter, which was an honour given out by kings. And the fact that this is placed underneath this painting of the Stuart king, it is possible that Lord Burlington was alluding to the fact that actually he had been given the Order of the Garter by the exiled king, the would-be James III.
Lord Burlington, he's right at the heart of the Hanoverian establishment. His wife works for Caroline, the princess. Isn't this all just a mad conspiracy theory?
It could be indeed, but then one has to wonder why he did incorporate these treasonous images into his building.
That's a very good point.
I can show you some more if we head through into that room.
Take me to your secret clues.
As you can see up there, it's the second Earl of Burlington, so the Earl's father, and he's sitting with two of his close cronies, and they're obviously having a toast. They've each got a glass of wine. The central figure is the Earl, and he is holding a ring over the contents of his glass, which literally was a toast across the water. So he was toasting kings across the water, which was none other than the exiled James III, as he would have been.
Who's living in France, across the channel?
Precisely. So that is a piece of Jacobite propaganda, there's no doubt about it.
Now, if what you're saying is right, and that people right at the heart of the Hanoverian establishment living in Neo-Palladian buildings could in fact be secretly expressing treason through their architecture, what does that say about the stability of the Georgian monarchy?
Well, it wasn't very stable. There was a lot of support for the Jacobites. Nobody knew which way it was going to go. In living memory, we had kings that had been ousted from the throne and new ones brought in, and we also had kings that had been returned from exile, like Charles II in 1660. So it was an uncertain time. There was almost a civil war going on under the surface, and no one knew who to support.
"1715 brought the first big crisis of George's reign. A rebellion by the Jacobites. They intended to replace George with his Catholic nemesis, James III, and were joined by some disgruntled Tory members of Parliament. One of them shouted out in a debate that George could never love Britain. The rebellion was crushed, but it made George paranoid. He turfed out all the Tories from his inner circle, and their rival Whigs were allowed to govern unchallenged. But there was still the problem of Jacobite propaganda. George the turnip-headed yokel.
To counter this image of George the turnip head, his supporters instead described him as George the Dragon Slayer. They associated him with the patron saint of England, the soldier saint, who ever since the Reformation had been shown slaying the dragon of popery or Roman Catholicism. Associating German George I with the very English Saint George did a lot to naturalise his foreignness.
I think that this portrait of George is the most important of his reign. Because this image would pass through the hands of every single one of his subjects. It's being worked on here at the Royal Collection Trust's conservation studios.
This portrait of George I was painted just 7 months into his new reign. He's projecting quite a serious and sober image here. The main colour is grey. There isn't the sort of flamboyance of his Stuart predecessors. And the picture is in profile, and that's because it was used for the image on his coins. These little mini portraits of the king were the closest that most of his new subjects were ever going to get to him. Another important thing is that he's dressed in armour. He's saying, I'm not afraid to fight for my rights. And he'd spent most of the 1690s fighting for Christianity against the Muslim Ottoman Empire. This is an important part of his image. Onward, Christian soldiers.
George had one more obvious advantage. He was a man. Daniel Defoe was one of many writers who rejoiced that Queen Anne was gone. There was no longer a useless woman on the throne, he wrote, but a warrior king able to wield the sword. And George also benefited from the fact that people didn't know that much about him.
Some people could say that George was a turnip head, and others could say that he was a dragon slayer, because he seemed to have a curious absence of personality. He was quite shy and retiring. He was difficult to get to know. But his sobriety and his frugality, he was very careful with his money, had a certain appeal, though, to a nation of shopkeepers.
Britain was fast becoming the most commercially successful country in Europe. Daniel Defoe picked up on this when he wrote his book, A Tour Through the Whole Island of Great Britain. It's a rough guide to Britain, from Leith to London. Just one of the many markets Defoe describes is London's Leadenhall, which has infinite provisions of all sorts, be it flesh, fish or fowl. Professor John Mullen believes that Defoe captures a period of the most rapid economic growth that Britain had ever seen.
What's the point of this survey of the markets and the tour around the whole country?
Well, because I think that he's trying to get a picture of the island and its history, but also of its activity, of the island now.
And he's interested in Britain as a whole, isn't he?
Yeah,
This is important.
Absolutely. I mean, England and Scotland are unified in 1707, and Defoe is a great fan of this project. And he thinks that the ability of people in different parts of Britain, notably Scotland and Wales, to come together in one sort of commercially unified whole is a sign that the British are sort of modern and enlightened in a way that those continentals aren't at all.
And do you think that he was a supporter of the people at the top, the Hanoverian monarchs themselves, George I, George II? What did he think of them?
I think he thought the Hanoverian monarchs were absolutely necessary,
Yeah.
because they were there to stop us having a Catholic king who would be a tyrant and would tell everybody what to do and would return us to a kind of court-centred and kind of, yes, tyrannical state.
Yeah.
So they were important, but to fend things off rather than to do things, actually. They were a safeguard.
So in this very bustling, commercially successful Britain, where's the place for religion? What does he think about that?
He says there is no Protestant and Catholic in a good bargain. In other words, he thinks that in a proper commercial nation, religious toleration is much more likely. People won't worry about their differences because the things that bind them together, the business of making money, is much more important.
Those are important words then. There is no Protestant or Catholic in a good bargain.
Yes.
That's-
When you're doing the deal,
Yeah.
you're not worrying about, you know, your petty differences. And I mean, he does believe that that trade actually unifies a nation.
This was a brave new economic world where religious bigotry gave way to profit. George I was tolerant in religious matters and saw economic progress as a solution to society's divisions. Britons didn't yet love their new ruler, but they were pretty pleased with the stability that he was providing. He was beginning to win grudging affection outside the palace gates. But the greater threat came from inside, because he was the head of the most dysfunctional royal family since Henry VIII.
Meet Sophia Dorothea. This is the ex-wife of George I. She's a very significant person in the royal family. She is, after all, the mother of the future king, George II. And yet this is the only contemporary portrait of her in the whole of the royal collection. There's a reason for that. She was talked about in whispers at the court of George I because of what she'd done.
Back in Germany, before coming over to Britain, George had married his first cousin, Sophia Dorothea of Zella. But it wasn't a love match. It was a marriage of state, a strategic move by the House of Hanover to increase its territory. Sophia and George cared little for one another. But George did care about his dignity and his reputation.
Sophia started an adulterous relationship with a Swede, Count Königsmark, who was serving in the Hanoverian army. Unfortunately, they weren't discreet. Their letters got out. Here's a sample from him to her. "What joy, what rapture have I tasted in your arms? Ye gods, what a night I spent." With this sort of thing circulating through the drawing rooms of Europe, though, George was humiliated.
A scandal was about to unfold that would inflame court gossip and spawn conspiracy theories for years to come. It all came to a head here at the family's palace on the River Leine.
One night, here at the Leine Palace, we hear that Count Königsmark was creeping along the corridors to Sophia's room when he was set upon by an assassin, and this is the spot in the river where the Swede's dead body is said to have been thrown.
The culprits were never apprehended. The whole affair was hushed up, and George never spoke about his estranged wife, her lover, or the murder ever again.
Count Königsmark's disappearance was wrapped up in mystery, but we do know exactly what happened next to Sophia. She was put on trial for the crime of adultery. She was divorced by her husband, and his punishment was to lock her up in a remote German castle for the rest of her life. That sounds pretty bad, but there was worse. The couple had a son, another George, the future George II of Great Britain. He was only 11. Sophia was now parted from her son, and he would never see his mother again.
This left a massive gap in the young Prince George's life, for which he naturally blamed his father. It was this traumatic event that triggered what you might call an Oedipal conflict between George I and his son, Prince George. This feud would have a cataclysmic effect on the royal family for decades to come. Not even Prince George's marriage and the birth of his own children could heal the rift. The tension escalated here at St. James's Palace over the birth of the prince's second son, yet another George.
An embarrassing kerfuffle broke out at this baby's christening. The occasion was gate-crashed by a favoured courtier of the king. The prince was pretty annoyed about this, and he said, "You are a rascal. I will find you." The implication was, "I'll find you later to give you a piece of my mind." But unfortunately, because of the prince's thick German accent, what the guy heard was, "You are a rascal. I will fight you." He took it as an invitation to a duel, a dreadful breach of court etiquette. The king got to hear about all of this, and he was furious. He decided to banish his son and his daughter-in-law, the Prince and the Princess of Wales, right out of St. James's Palace.
All this was embarrassing for the prince and princess, but worse was to come. The king decided to keep behind their children, his grandchildren, as hostages to ensure future good behaviour.
The Princess of Wales was in tears as she said goodbye to her 3 little girls and to her newborn baby boy. This little boy soon fell sick, and the Princess of Wales believed that the king gave him the wrong medical treatment. Shortly afterwards, he died. And in the National Archives, there's an account of money paid for a pitiful little square of black velvet, just big enough to cover the coffin of a baby.
Now, between father and son, there was all-out war. The courts of Europe could talk about nothing else but the British royal scandal. In London, the nobility began to take sides.
Once the court had split into two factions, each developed its own separate social life. At the King's court, people tended to be older and more respectable. At the Prince of Wales's court, the courtiers were younger and more dynamic, and at this court, they had the better parties. At these parties, people had so much fun that some virgins conceived. Now, you might think that this was very dangerous and destabilising, but there is an argument that this was a healthy development in a parliamentary democracy, because if you wanted to criticise the king, you didn't have to take up arms or commit treason. You could just go to a different type of social event. The concept of His Majesty's loyal opposition had been born.
The Prince of Wales's new court effectively became a home for rebels. After the Whigs won a landslide victory in the elections of 1722, many of the defeated Tories went round the corner from the royal palace to Prince George's house in Leicester Square instead. It was a way of showing dissatisfaction with the king that wasn't quite as drastic as joining James III and the Jacobites. Quarrels like this between royal fathers and sons, exacerbated by the politicians, would happen throughout the 18th century. This new vision of Britain, with its opposition and disputes, its freedom of speech, if you like, appealed to one of the greatest thinkers in Europe. He went by the pen name of Voltaire, and his fiery political views had already seen him persecuted by the French government.
"How I love English boldness," said Voltaire. "How I love those who say what they think. Those who only half think are only half alive." Voltaire knew what he was talking about, because saying what he thought had got him into terrible trouble in France, so much so that he'd been put in prison in the Bastille twice. So in 1726, to seek asylum from all of this, he'd come over to England.
What Voltaire found was a culture of tolerance. Indeed, in comparison to France, he labelled Britain as a land of liberty. Professor Nicholas Cronk believes that George I's rather liberal view of kingship allowed writers like Voltaire to thrive.
When Voltaire came to England then, things were very different. What differences did he notice?
Well, in France, under the Ancien regime, for the most part, writers live through patronage. So you find an aristocrat, or maybe the king, who gives you a pension, you dedicate your works to
You suck up, basically.
You suck up, basically. When Voltaire comes to England, what he finds is a society where the court is much less all-powerful than it is in France. It doesn't quite have the same glitz or the same prestige, but at the same time, there are more centres of power outside the court. There is a political debate between the two houses of Parliament and the king, so that's not like the French system.
Voltaire later writes that "I think and I write like an Englishman." This was clearly an important time for him.
Voltaire comes to London and finds that there are Catholics and Jews, and, as well as Anglicans. So there is, of course, greater tolerance than there is in France. The idea that the English were free was something that they were very pleased about. So to some extent, Voltaire's picked this up from the contemporary English press. You know, you find it in The Spectator or The Craftsman or whatever. We'd like to think it's very grand about the big noble ideals of freedom of mankind. I think for him it's also about freedom of the writer. I think he just sees that there is a literary space in England, partly because of these different forms of publication, where he thinks a writer can express himself differently from a writer in France, who is much more tied into how things are at court.
What's the best-known work that Voltaire produced during this time in England?
Well, the work that he's most famous for now is the book that in French is called the Lettres Philosophiques, Philosophical Letters, but in England was published as the Letters Concerning the English Nation. This is a book where he talks about English liberty, he talks about English religions, he talks about the English toleration of different religions, in a way which actually is quite flattering to the English, and of course the English liked it because they like being praised by a foreigner. So it has a rather extraordinary parallel career. So the Lettres Philosophiques was condemned and burnt in the Paris law courts. Voltaire was forbidden from ever using the title again in any publication. Whereas in England, the Letters on the English Nation is republished in Edinburgh and Dublin and Glasgow, and it's an 18th century British bestseller.
Voltaire wrote that the English were the only people on earth who'd been able to limit the power of kings by establishing wise government. This meant that all over Europe, George I got a reputation as a protector of progressive views. But in Britain, his reputation had taken a knock after the christening quarrel. The king's supporters were defecting to the Prince of Wales's court, and he had to try to win them back. He embarked on a plan to redecorate Kensington Palace. He hoped there to host parties that would be the most spectacular in London.
Now, this room is pretty sensational. Take a look at that ceiling.
This is the cupola room. The commission was fought over between designers of the old guard, still working in the 17th century style, and adopters of the new Georgian look that would define the future.
Everybody expected that this plum royal commission would go to Sir James Thornhill, who'd been mopping up all the work of this type. But Thornhill had got a bit complacent, and the king liked a bargain. Thornhill's estimate was £800, an awful lot of money. So the king was persuaded to look at a young, new painter instead, William Kent, fresh back from Rome. He wanted the job. His estimate was half of Thornhill's.
William Kent got the commission, and this is what he produced. Kent is playing with perspective, turning this room into a space seemingly twice as tall. He uses paint to emulate architecture. But his more traditional colleagues found it garish and tasteless.
It's not surprising that there was a bit of carping and naysaying when this room was first completed, because the British just weren't used to this sort of thing. It's like a completely fake Roman palace interior made out of wood and paint. And William Kent was doing something entirely new here.
Kensington Palace would be Kent's breakthrough in Britain. Rufus Bird is deputy surveyor of the Queen's Works of Art and believes that Kent was the first interior designer.
He wanted to get involved in every single aspect. He was a complete sort of attention to detail in every corner. So if furniture was going to go into interiors that he designed, he wanted to make sure that it harmonised perfectly.
A bit of a control freak.
A little bit, perhaps, yeah.
And just looking at it, what are the visual clues that this is a Kent design?
Well, firstly, you have this very obvious Roman symbolism. The particular elements are the fish scales, which you see on the panels of the legs, and the fish scales are associated with dolphins in the 18th century, and dolphins drew the shell chariot of Venus, and of course there is this large shell in the centre here, and then there's another shell at the top of the back there.
Why is William Kent making all of these classical references?
Well, in the early 18th century, Kent had been to Italy and came back filled with a desire to bring Italy and Rome and the patterns associated with ancient Rome into Britain. And so this is a major change that we see. So France in the 17th century had been this dominant artistic leader, if you like, and then in the 18th century it's Kent and his supporters who really want to bring Italy into England.
Would you describe it as almost like a piece of stage scenery, not intended for use, but to look good?
Exactly, that's right, yeah. And so often court functions, particularly at this date, are great theatrical events, and the spectacle was all. And the furnishing of the rooms was just as important as what people wore and how they populated those spaces.
It was Kent who heralded in an entirely new kind of Georgian interior and helped make George I's parties a glamorous success. Kent's triumphant progress up the social ladder from humble sign painter to royal decorator reveals what was now possible in terms of social mobility in Britain. And around this time, George I decided to celebrate his own meteoric rise by constructing a scientific marvel.
It was back in Hanover that George I spent a huge amount of money on the most technologically ambitious project of his reign. When this fountain was first switched on, it was the tallest fountain in Europe. It was based on the ideas of Leibniz, and it spurts up 35 meters into the air. It wasn't just a toy. The fountain is actually an analogy for the rise of the House of Hanover. They too spurted up, defying gravity. They went from being a second-rate princely house to being one of the most important dynasties in Europe.
George fancied himself as an enlightened monarch interested in learning and science. And he now turned his attention to the British economy. He needed to deal with the problem of the national debt, and his administration took a gamble on a newly emerging phenomenon, the stock market. They sold the nation's debt to a private business, the South Sea Company, in exchange for a monopoly in the fledgling British slave trade. If that wasn't dodgy enough, the company then issued shares, and the British were such big fans of gambling that they bought in their thousands.
By 1720, this financial revolution was well underway. And I think of this activity of share trading as being very characteristic of this early Georgian period. People now realized that you could make money out of servicing the debts of other people. Doesn't that sound familiar?
George was about to plunge Britain into financial chaos. The whole affair became known as the South Sea Bubble. Share prices rose so quickly that the company was worth £2.5 trillion in today's money. There were even playing cards produced that charted this frenzy of speculation. Dr. Helen Paul is an economic historian who's investigated the boom and the bust of the South Sea Company.
What was the atmosphere like in 1720 then as the prices began to rise?
The prices went up far too high to be sustainable, and once you realise that you've got naive investors coming in, other people try to buy the same shares to sell out to them. But you also got a lot of money coming in from Paris, where the stock market had recently crashed, trying to find a safe haven. That pushes up prices. Eventually, the bubble has to burst, and when the smart money leaves, everyone else panics. So this man has lost money in the company. He's actually thrown himself from the window here.
A ruined South Sea jobber of renown who leaps from a lofty window headlong down. Oh dear, and it's saying, South Sea stock, oh those villains.
There was a huge amount of outcry. People were called the South Sea sufferers. There was a lot of debate about whether people who gained money should be forced to hand it back, but people who gained money didn't say very much about it.
Is it the beginning of a sort of fear, a tarnishing of the image of stock market?
There'd always been the sense that finance was somehow dirty. Land was so important. These people weren't necessarily the landed class. So there'd always been this sense of grubbiness about it. And there was a lot of criticism of financiers per se, many of whom were assumed to be foreigners and Jews, Catholics, and other alleged undesirables. So this card here shows a Jewish broker being forcibly baptised in a horse pond.
Drown the Jewish dog. There he goes, into the pond.
And this is just one card. There are several that are anti-Semitic. And it says here, all the Jews deserve as much.
So blame the Jews for this particular bubble.
That's right, but of course Jewish people have been associated with usury or finance for many centuries.
This really unpleasant anti-Semitism exposed the holes in Georgian Britain's facade as a land of liberty and tolerance. To make things worse, the corruption of the South Sea scandal went right to the heart of the government. Backhanders were paid to politicians and insider trading was rife. When the bubble burst, George had to call in a fixer. He chose his closest political ally, Robert Walpole. Having sold his shares at the top of the market, though, people thought that Walpole too had his snout in the South Sea trough.
This is Change Alley in the city, and it was in the coffee houses along here that all the wheeling and the dealing of the South Sea bubble took place. When it burst, they were full of panic and fear. And now up pops Robert Walpole to limit the damage. He was put in charge of an investigation into the crisis, but it didn't really go anywhere. It was thought that he'd protected prominent people from charges of bribery and corruption. And because he'd shielded them from the consequences of their actions, people called him the Screen Master General.
There was a growing feeling that once again the elite had won. But Walpole didn't get off entirely scot-free. There was a new force at work in Georgian society: satire. One of the Georgian age's most notorious images is Walpole's huge naked bottom, blocking the way into the treasury. To get on in 18th century government, this is what you had to kiss. These satirists used lewd images and language to skewer hypocrisy, from a diving competition into the sewers of Fleet Street to a giant weeing on the royal palace. The satirists were reaping the benefit of a strange thing that had happened at the end of the previous century. According to the modern satirist Martin Rowson, Parliament had inadvertently made this satire boom possible.
Could you print anything you wanted?
Well, it's, I think, one of the most beautiful moments, certainly in British and probably in world history, because it was an accident if they were meant to be renewing the Licensing Act, which was essentially press censorship, the royal licence, and somebody forgot to put it in the press in the parliamentary timetable. Suddenly, Pandora's box was opened.
You could print anything you wanted.
You could print anything you wanted. There was a sudden eruption of freedom of speech and of satire. And whereas people had previously been writing satires on behalf of rich men and powerful men to attack other rich and powerful men because it meant they had a protector, now they could write whatever they wanted.
So you could now print all kinds of naughty stuff with impunity.
It meant suddenly that people were liberated to satirise everything. And after Leveson last year, when people were saying, we fought for centuries for this freedom of the press. No, we didn't. It just happened by mistake because somebody forgot to put it in the parliamentary timetables. And it's what led to our understanding of the 18th century as not necessarily being the age of George I, George II, George III, but the age of Swift and Pope and Hogarth and later Gilray and Sterne and the rest of them. There is this open sewer of satire running through the Enlightenment.
How popular was this? Who did it appeal to?
It's a weird relationship because on the one hand, this is scurrilous, filthy stuff. On the other hand, the people who bought Gilray's stuff and who bought Hogarth's stuff were the people who were being satirised because they understood it was part of the joke.
Satire allowed people to criticise the highest echelons of society without getting thrown into the Tower of London. But the satirists upped the ante once again when writers like Jonathan Swift were bold enough to have a go at the monarchy itself. In Gulliver's Travels, Swift has his main character, Lemuel Gulliver, wash up on the island of Lilliput. Here he found a tiny royal court where everyone was obsessed with climbing the greasy pole.
How did Swift satirise the monarchy?
Gulliver's Travels is a prolonged satire on the whole notion of courts. So there's all this stuff about people having to jump over higher sticks to get preferment, courtiers having to do this rope dance on a tightrope, the levels of corruption, the levels of venality. It's not that difficult a satire to say these people who thought they were sort of such great men are really little tiny things. And of course, all the people in George I's court recognised what it was all about.
Did these people not mind Jonathan Swift laughing at them?
It is part of the game. If you're in a position of power over your fellow citizens and you can't take a joke about yourself, then really you're not quite the thing. You're not quite right, because you should recognise that your position is inherently ludicrous.
All this satire was so popular that the king and the politicians had to just take it on the chin. better to laugh along, pretending that you were in on the joke. But it was Robert Walpole, not the king, who was the greatest target of fun. George I often just wasn't there. He'd gone back to Germany.
Here's George I on a happy hunting holiday back in Hanover. These are his ancestral forests. You get the sense that this is where he thinks he really belongs. And he's brought an awful lot of people with him. We can see here the whole of his German household. There are Mustafa and Mohammed, his valets. But he's also brought with him some very prominent British politicians. Me Lord Townsend, as it says here, he was a top Whig. And here we have Me Lady Townsend. He's brought his wife with him. And this is a real problem. When the king comes over to Germany and he brings all these people, it's like he sucks the life out of British politics. Nothing can happen in London without him. And something of a power vacuum opens up.
And when the king's away, Walpole will play. Many of George's ministers were strongly opposed to his frequent visits to Hanover, but Walpole saw them as an opportunity.
This was the origin of modern government. When the king was away in Germany, his ministers got into the habit of meeting by themselves, without him, making autonomous decisions. These meetings of the government ministers were chaired by, who else? Sir Robert Walpole. He was first amongst equals. And he came up with the concept of cabinet solidarity. Once they'd all agreed on a policy, they had to defend it in public or else resign. This is the essence of the system of cabinet government that we still have today.
George had always kept his Hanover base. I wonder if deep down he was worried that Parliament would change their mind and take away his throne. He needn't have worried. For the century before his reign, Britain had been eating itself. There had been civil wars and revolutions and disputes about inheritance. With George I, though, came stability, freedom of speech, and modern government. George may not have been the sharpest or the brightest or the most vigorous king, but thanks to his benign rule, Britain was on the way to becoming truly great. For himself, though, George still called Hanover home. Indeed, he was travelling back here at the very moment of his death.
George's body ended up in this mausoleum overlooking his beloved Palace of Herrenhausen, the place that he'd never really wanted to leave. Some of George's British subjects called him Lucky George, this man who'd so unexpectedly inherited their throne. But I think of him as Unlucky George. He never really wanted to leave Hanover. He was deeply unlucky in his personal life with his divorce and his terrible relationship with his son. The history books have overlooked him because he wasn't showy. He had no charisma. But sometimes it's the quiet ones that you've got to watch. I think I'd say not so much Lucky George, but Lucky Britain.
Next time, as their personal divisions deepen, the royal family have to deal with a new force that's reshaping Britain, the power of the public.
This was a very dangerous moment for the Hanoverian royal family. If any one of them were to make a mistake, it could break the monarchy.
It was a summer afternoon in June 1727. The King's chief minister, Sir Robert Walpole, turned up unannounced at the country residence of George, Prince of Wales, and his wife, Caroline. He was out of breath and in a state of great panic. Walpole was the bearer of momentous news. King George I was dead.
Sir Robert Walpole tried to get in to see the Prince and Princess of Wales, but a lady in waiting said, "Stop, you can't go in, they're asleep." But Sir Robert Walpole insisted. He said, "I've got to go in with my news." And the poor old Prince of Wales was rather caught on the hop. At the moment when he learned that he'd become King George II of Great Britain and Ireland, he was probably still buttoning up his breeches. There was an element of farce about this, and George, as king, would have to up his game. No more afternoon naps for him.
4 months later, George was crowned at Westminster Abbey. The coronation anthem Zadok the Priest was specially composed for the occasion by Handel. It accompanied George's transformation from prince to king. George II's reign would be long and turbulent. German-born, he found himself ruling a Britain that was heading into the future at lightning speed. New money had forged a new middling sort of people in society who questioned the established order. Affairs of state were being discussed in taverns and coffee houses. And the royal family found themselves mocked in newspapers, in satirical prints, and in the theatres.
It would have been difficult for any dynasty, but this lot was still new. They only had shallow roots. This was a very dangerous moment for the Hanoverian royal family. If any one of them were to make a mistake, it could break the monarchy.
But this was the most dysfunctional royal family since the Tudors. Their feuding would shake the state to its foundations. The first Georgian kings have fascinated me for years. And for this series, I've been given access to pieces from the royal collection as they're prepared for an exhibition at the Queen's Gallery, Buckingham Palace.
These works of art, many of them commissioned or owned by the first Georgian kings, reveal how they had to adapt to a public who were no longer merely just subjects. And in doing this, the Hanoverians invented the modern monarchy.
This is George II's bed. At first glance, it may look like any other grand Georgian bed. But actually, this is his travelling bed, which could be collapsed down into 54 separate pieces. The original flat pack.
The fact that George needed a special bed for travelling tells us something important. He was always, it seems, popping off back to Hanover. This was a real problem for his British subjects. It looked like George's heart still lay in his homeland. His absences reminded the British that he was alien, that he had another country to think about as well as Britain. To many of them, George became the king who wasn't there.
And as well as the small matter of ruling both Hanover and Britain, much of the king's time was taken up by his mistresses, which was really quite annoying to his long-suffering but loyal German wife.
Let me introduce you to Caroline. She's my favourite queen. As you can see from the bust, she's not exactly a fairy tale princess. She's middle-aged, she's overweight, she's had 8 children. But she had this wonderfully warm and witty personality. It made her very good at her job as queen, welcoming people to court. But there was much more complexity and depth to her than that. You do get a sense that she was bored and sort of blunted by her royal duties. She would rather have been cracking jokes with her clever friends somewhere else. And I think that if you look at the corner of her mouth here, it's twitching like she's about to start laughing.
While the king was prickly and distant, Caroline was highly sociable. In her private apartments at Hampton Court, she gathered together a sparkling circle of intellectuals and wits.
Caroline, at heart, was a warm and convivial person. She loved to eat and she loved to talk. The British courtiers really relished the way that she could remember little personal details about each of them. She'd say things like, "My lord, how's your little girl? Is she better?" Or one of them remembered that the Queen was so interested in my print collection that I had to go home and get all the rest of my books to show her. Because of her husband's poor social skills, Caroline becomes the user-friendly public face of the Hanoverian monarchy. She was its likeable and approachable ambassador.
Caroline wielded enormous power and influence, especially over her husband. This made her an indispensable ally to the king's leading minister, Sir Robert Walpole. As Prince of Wales, George had been wary of Walpole, calling him a rogue and a rascal. But Caroline persuaded George as king to keep Walpole on. It proved to be a smart move. Walpole could get things done.
Walpole was the ultimate fixer. He spent a lot of time whispering into people's ears. What about job X for person Y? If you wanted your son to be a captain in the army, for example, Walpole was your man. His power was cemented when the king gave him this house in Downing Street. He accepted it not as an individual, but on behalf of his office, which was First Lord of the Treasury, as it still says on the front door.
This job title is better known to us today as Prime Minister. Downing Street was Walpole's reward for his ability to provide a stable government and a lavish budget for the king's court. A year into his reign, George began making preparations for his first trip to Hanover as king.
Now, who was going to rule Britain? Well, Parliament passed the Regency Act, putting Queen Caroline in charge. And this confirmed what a lot of people already thought, that Caroline was the one who wore the trousers. As the popular poem had it, "You may strut, dapper George, but 'twill all be in vain. We know 'tis Caroline, not you, that reign."
Caroline worked hard to strengthen the Georgian dynasty. And one way she did it was by publicly encouraging the intellectual upheaval, generally called the Enlightenment. As Princess of Wales, Caroline had brought about a breakthrough in the fight against smallpox. The disease was attacking the population, people said, like a destroying angel. Professor of Medicine Gareth Williams is going to show me the grim details.
What we've got here are the three key stages of the smallpox rash. So we've got the early vesicles here. Here are the pustules getting quite nicely developed. And over there is the stage of the confluent rash. This is where all the pustules, they're full of pus, and there are so many of them that you're left with something like that.
My goodness.
It was one of the great killers. Smallpox actually killed 1 person in 12.
What happens in the early 18th century? There's a change, isn't there?
Well, they got reports from Turkey of a way of preventing smallpox, reported by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who was a bit of a gal, and she was the wife of the ambassador to Turkey. And she heard about an extraordinary practice, which was giving a healthy child smallpox deliberately. And it sounds completely counterintuitive, but in fact it was actually one of the safest and one of the most effective medical procedures of the day.
How did Caroline, who was then the Princess of Wales, get to hear about it?
Well, it was through Lady Mary. She became a good personal friend of Princess Caroline, Princess of Wales. Caroline said, well, OK, let's see the evidence. So the evidence was quite bold, actually. Lady Mary had her daughter inoculated with smallpox the following spring. This was in 1721. And it was a really good time to do this experiment because smallpox had broken out in London and people were running scared again.
So Caroline is convinced that this really works. And it seems to me that the most important thing that she does is to inoculate her own children.
Exactly right. But the broader issue is that, yes, you've got a royal who's engaged. You've got a royal who is phenomenally bright and actually interested in not just the people and their problems, but in scientific and medical solutions to those problems.
It was this scientific approach that separated Caroline and the Hanoverians from their Stuart predecessors. The Stuarts had often laid their hands upon the sick, believing they had semi-divine powers of healing. But Caroline placed her trust in medicine, not magic. The French philosopher Voltaire commented on smallpox in his book Letters on England. He said that Europe thought the British crazy for this business of making a well child sick. Voltaire tells us that inoculation really caught on. England followed her example, he says. And since then, at least 10,000 children owe their lives to the Queen and Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. And as many girls are indebted to them for their beauty. Voltaire's book also highlighted other great changes underway in Britain. He noted how commerce had enriched the citizens, helping to make them freer. This freedom had in turn made greater entrepreneurship possible, widening wealth overall. And nowhere was this more true than in London. Here, economic changes were creating a new kind of behaviour.
There was lots of new money in Georgian Britain, a lot of it in the hands of a new rank of people in society. They weren't aristocrats, and they weren't the workers either. They were what was called the middling sort. Some of them were professionals, like doctors and lawyers and clergymen. Others ran shops, or they were in trade, particularly in the new products of sugar and cotton. And like all these people here at the market, they had money to burn on things that they didn't really need, like vases for their houses, or trips to the pleasure gardens, or really expensive cups of coffee.
This emerging middling sort differentiated Britain from its continental neighbours, where the aristocracy still held sway. And with this new social class came new spending power. In 1720, a Yorkshireman called Charles Clay came to London, hoping that some of this new money would come his way. His particular wheeze was to construct miraculously elaborate clocks, which he then displayed to the public for a fee. Rufus Bird is going to show me one of Clay's craziest creations.
It was originally called the Temple and Oracle of Apollo. It is an organ clock, which curiously has this magnificent 17th century Augsburg casket resting on top of it. And then in the pedestal, you have this organ, which plays 10 different tunes arranged by Handel.
How does it actually work?
If we open this door here, you can see inside there is the weights and the pulley and then the barrel organ itself. I can play a tune. Shall we play one?
Yes, let's hear it. And who was he making it for? What was the point of it?
It was a commercial enterprise. We know that through the advertisement which his widow placed in a newspaper in 1743. And I've got a copy of it just here. Mrs. Clay describes this work of art as being the whole exceeding by many degrees anything ever exhibited to public view in any nation or by any artist whatsoever.
Amazing, and it's yours for a shilling.
That's right, you can see this and hear it for 1 shilling.
50 years earlier, Charles Clay would have been making a specialised item like this for a royal patron. But in this new Georgian age, Clay could use his clocks to make a living from very different patrons, paying customers. This early Georgian period was fast becoming the age of the self-made man. There was one individual who epitomised this, Alexander Pope. Pope was a satirist with legendary bite, who coined classic phrases like, "Fools rush in where angels fear to tread." But Pope is remembered as much for his business nous as for his heroic couplets. He showed that a writer could earn a fortune by selling his work directly to the public. And his success allowed him to live in some style. Although his grand villa in Twickenham no longer stands, one intriguing part of it has survived: a grotto.
This is not just an exciting underground grotto, it's also a museum of mineralogy. Look at this crystal set into the walls there, it's winking at me. And originally there were little fragments of mirror stuck in amongst the stones. So when you came down here with a lamp and you turned it on, suddenly rays were shooting everywhere and the whole thing was glittering. Ooh, now I think that is a piece of the Giant's Causeway. You can see the 6 sides of the basalt there. And there is a picture that shows Alexander Pope doing some writing down here, but you'd think it was a bit dark for that. Now, how did he pay for all of this? The answer is this book. This is the pocket version of his famous translation of the Iliad by Homer. And he made money out of his work like a modern author would. He didn't have a single rich patron funding his lifestyle. He sold individual copies to a broad range of people. If you look at the first deluxe edition of the book, you'll see the list of subscribers headed by Caroline. So she was acting here as a new type of patron. She's just buying the book, giving him some money, but more importantly, offering him her moral support so that other people would buy the book too. And they did. It made him the equivalent in today's money of £400,000, what he needed to buy his villa and to build his grotto. Pope was very proud of the way he'd achieved all of this independently. He said, "I live and I thrive, not indebted to any prince or peer alive."
However, Alexander Pope was only 4'6", suffered from curvature of the spine, and was a Catholic too. He was always an outsider. When he said he was in no one's debt, he really did mean it.
Pope decided to write his own version of Homer's Iliad. But his was going to be in English, and it was going to be a great big spoof. The poem was called the Dunciad.
From the very start of the Dunciad, it's clear that not even the royal family are safe from Pope's poisonous pen. You by whose care in vain decried and cursed, still Dunce the Second reigns like Dunce the First.
Who do you think that he meant by that?
This blatant reference to George II kicks off a depiction of a society dominated by dimwits and ruled by a king of the dunces.
He was under the thumb of a female character called Dullness. She was very dreary and rather fat too, and by this, Pope meant Caroline.
Laborious, heavy, busy, bold, and blind, she ruled in native anarchy the mind.
She'd been his big supporter as Princess of Wales, but when she became queen, she had other fish to fry. Pope felt that he'd been neglected, so he turned against her, using his very wounding weapons of words. He basically says in the Dunciad that she's a bit of a porker and rather boring.
But just as Pope's relations with Caroline turned sour, another member of the royal family was ready to take advantage. Prince Frederick, Caroline's son and heir to the throne, befriended the poet in her place. He was even painted with a copy of Pope's translation of Homer in his hand. Caroline now had a rival in her patronage of the arts.
Frederick was a genuine music lover. Sometimes he'd give a concert by an open window as the evening fell, playing his cello. And all the court servants would creep out into the courtyard to listen. Frederick's parents felt that this was undignified behaviour, vulgar, entertaining the masses. You could forgive Frederick for thinking that his parents had abandoned him. When he was 7, they left him behind in Hanover when George and Caroline came over to London in 1714. There were good political reasons for this. Frederick was going to be the family's representative in Hanover so that the people there wouldn't think they'd been entirely forgotten about. The problems emerged years later when Frederick came over to London himself, now a grown-up. It wasn't just that he'd lost touch with his parents and needed to rebuild the relationship. It was worse than that. It turned out that he and his parents couldn't stand the sight of each other.
And it was this hostility that would pose the greatest threat to the Georgian monarchy. Frederick's openness and his social nature were in marked contrast to his grumpy father, George II. The Prince of Wales's common touch would be perfectly captured in a painting by the artist Joseph Nichols.
This is St. James's Park on a summer evening, and everybody's out for a walk. A French visitor tells us that sometimes the park was so packed that you couldn't help touching your neighbour. He says that some people came to see, others to be seen, all were on the lookout for adventures. He says that there were many priestesses of Venus about in the park. And the brilliant thing about this painting is that it's like a snapshot of the whole of Georgian society. We have low-life characters here, like these ladies feeding their babies. Here is kissing going on. Here is a man taking a leak. We also have commerce. These ladies are selling cups of milk to the gentry. Over here, we have high society. This lady is taking snuff. This foppish gentleman is doing a very fancy French sort of bow. And right at the centre of all of this is Frederick, the Prince of Wales. And that's what makes it such a British scene. In France, the king was stuck out at Versailles. He was aloof and remote from his people. But Frederick thinks of himself as the people's prince. He's got the popular touch. He's on a royal walkabout. You can see people turning to watch him. And this is very typical of Frederick. He doesn't position himself above the crowd, but right at its centre.
The royal court was no longer setting the rules for fashionable life. And Frederick responded by joining in the contemporary craze for refined but informal gatherings. This was reflected in a new kind of painting, the conversation piece. Rather than formal group portraits, conversation pieces showed people actually enjoying each other's company. Here's a lively dinner party, with the host dishing out lots of drinks, guests fumbling with each other, and a fat clergyman looking on with worldly satisfaction. Even the royal family were depicted in this new style of painting.
This is an oil sketch for a conversation piece of the royal family. It was done by the artist William Hogarth on spec. His hope was that the king would really like it and that he'd buy it. It's got all the hallmarks of a conversation piece. It's a family scene, mother, father, the children all talking to each other. But there were three very good reasons that George II was never going to buy this picture. Firstly, William Hogarth wasn't an artist in favour at court. There, the work was dominated by his rival, Queen Caroline's favourite artist, William Kent. Secondly, the very idea that George II would buy a piece of avant-garde art is ridiculous. He didn't like art at all. And thirdly, it's a bit of a farce, because it looks like a happy family, but in fact, this lot hated each other. There were terrible rivalries and tensions between these parents and these children.
Fortunately for Hogarth, he didn't actually need royal patronage to be successful. Like Alexander Pope, Hogarth was a freelancer with an entrepreneurial streak. This is his very nice pad in Chiswick. That he could afford it shows how well he understood what his customers wanted. And what they wanted was prints, the original affordable art.
Britain went wild for these characters and these images. But what most people were seeing wasn't Hogarth's own work. To keep things exclusive, he'd only produced enough prints to go to his list of just over 1,000 subscribers. But almost instantly, his rivals and copycats started to produce cheap knockoffs. The speed with which they did this was incredible. It was almost before the ink had dried on the originals.
A set of Hogarth prints, and of these knockoff copies too, can be found in the Royal Collection. I'm meeting senior curator Kate Hurd to see how they differed and what, if anything, the artist could do about it.
So I'm a subscriber. I've paid my money to Mr. Hogarth, and the print is going to come out. What am I going to get?
You're going to get 6 prints, of which this is the first one, showing the harlot of the Harlot's Progress arriving in London.
Oh dear, she's a fresh young girl.
Absolutely.
We know that it's going to be bad.
Hogarth made 1,240 of them and refused to make any more. One of his great selling points was that it's an exclusive thing. You know, you subscribe, you pay up front, you're one of the club that can have them.
What did you do if you weren't a subscriber then, but you wanted to own these images?
Well, you could actually get hold of slightly different copies. Not the real thing, but pirated copies, which were rushed out by the print sellers within a few weeks.
And it's reversed as well, isn't it?
Yes, that's because they're copying the original print.
So somebody's drawing it, here it is, and then he puts the ink on, and then he turns it over.
And it turns it back to front on the sheet of paper. But they're not bad prints, considering how quickly they were made.
And how did Hogarth respond to all of this? What action did he take?
He was furious. He'd had his initiative taken away from him, and he got together with a group of fellow printmakers, and they petitioned Parliament, which in 1735 published a Copyright Act, which allowed people like Hogarth for 14 years to have the copyright over their images, over their prints.
And if you copied the prints, you would be punished?
You would be fined.
And that law stood all the way until 1911?
It was a very impressive piece of legislation.
Was it known as Hogarth's?
It's known as Hogarth's Act, absolutely.
Hogarth's Act.
Yes.
If prints were popular, newspapers were even more so. During the course of the 18th century, newspaper production would rise from 1 million to just over 14 million a year. You didn't even need to purchase a copy yourself. Newspapers were available for browsing in your neighbourhood coffee house. What's really surprising is just how well informed people were.
Imagine that you and I are reasonably well-off, reasonably intelligent Georgian chaps. Before spending the afternoon at the pleasure garden or the theatre, perhaps we're going to pop into the coffee house to have a read of the newspapers. What sort of information is available to us in the London Journal of 1732? Well, an enormous range. Page 1 tells us about foreign affairs. We've got a report from Paris. Page 2 gives us a report from Hanover, where the King is this week. We've got a very detailed account of what he's up to there. On page 3, we've got a brand new fruit that's just been presented to Queen Caroline. It's ripe and in a state of utmost perfection, and it is a pineapple, a complete novelty. Now, you and I are not members of the court. We're members of the public.
And this is an enormous range of information that we've got access to. Our kings and queens aren't just faces on a coin, they're real characters in our minds. This isn't just a newspaper, it's an information superhighway. And now the world and his dog can have a well-informed opinion on current affairs.
What's more, the world and his dog weren't going to keep their opinions to themselves. Georgian coffee houses were called the penny universities. Pretty much blind to social status, they often hosted debating clubs. There was more to this than just passing the time. The Georgians had this new belief that you could refashion yourself into a person of taste by soaking up the right kind of books and ideas. To discuss all this, I'm meeting up with Lucy Ingalls, creator of the blog Georgian London.
Is this about self-improvement? Is this about Georgian people wanting to learn from each other?
Yes, very much about self-improvement. The new concept of the rising middle classes and what it was to educate yourself and improve yourself. And there was also this idea that there was only so much knowledge in the world and it could be known and mastered if you were only willing to apply yourself.
That's a brilliant idea. You could read every single book that existed if you tried hard.
Pretty much, yeah.
What's this you've got here on your computer?
This here is some information that I've gathered about one society in particular, the Robin Hood Society. They met every Monday evening.
And what did they get up to at these meetings?
Well, they said, first of all, that even though they would enjoy a Welsh rarebit and a pot of beer, it was not a drinking club, it was a disputing one. At those places, men feed their bodies, but at this one, they feed their mind.
And what sorts of people attended?
Well, we have a list of members of the club here. A baker, a doctor, a governor of the plantations, a soldier, an author, a comedian, a house painter, a genius.
A genius?
A genius,
Please
yes.
put that down as his profession, a genius.
It was a genius. A noted bug doctor and a highwayman.
No way!
Yeah.
A highwayman attended the club?
Absolutely.
A professional highwayman?
Yeah, and he was thought to be one of the best debaters, but he couldn't...
I bet. Did he use his gun?
Yeah, he couldn't stay off the roads, and he sadly met a sticky end at the end of a rope at Tyburn.
Oh dear.
I know.
Lost to the club, I would think, yes. So here we have a network of people who have only been brought together by the club itself. They're from different ranks in society.
Yes, and that is one of the key points of all these clubs, that they were deliberately bringing people together from all levels.
What did the king and the government think about these clubs? Because sometimes they were debating questions like, is the Prime Minister any good? This is quite dangerous.
Absolutely, very dangerous. The Robin Hood Society tried to get around this by publishing their set of rules, the things they weren't going to discuss, which was politics and God. But, however, they did discuss both.
Oh, that was just for show then. We're not going to discuss this, but really we are.
Exactly, which is why the members were supposed to be known to each other, so that you knew if you had a spy in the camp.
This culture of debate meant that the decisions of King and Parliament were held to public scrutiny. In 1733, Sir Robert Walpole introduced an excise bill to Parliament, imposing a tax on popular commodities like wine and tobacco. Now, nobody likes a new tax, especially not the self-confident new London trading classes.
There were riots outside Parliament, and Queen Caroline and Robert Walpole were burnt in effigy. Crucially, though, the king stood by his minister. He let it be known that to oppose his government was to oppose the king himself. If you went against Walpole, then, you were a traitor.
One of Walpole's opponents in Parliament was Lord Cobham. He had been a great supporter of the Hanoverian monarchy. But for his disloyalty, the king ejected Cobham from the House of Lords. Cobham retreated to his country house at Stowe. Here, he planted his revenge in the form of Stowe's magnificent landscape garden. In Georgian Britain, even gardening was political. The landscape garden was supposed to embody British liberty. A place where, as one Georgian put it, the eye can roam free. But Stowe also delivered a more pointed message. Cobham hid within it a series of secret meanings or metaphors for contemporary politics and morality.
Now, you weren't expected to work out all of these hidden secret meanings all by yourself. You could buy a guidebook to the gardens, like this original Georgian version. And it tells me that at this spot here, I have a decision to make. I can either turn up that way, which is the path of virtue. Up there we have temples dedicated to virtue and the heroes of history. Or I can go down that way. That's the route of vice. Down there, the book promises me lustful monks, women out of control, group sex and voyeurism.
The garden at Stowe certainly drew in the crowds. And Lord Cobham had thoughtfully built this inn on the outskirts to accommodate them all. The tourists who chose the path of virtue crossed a series of bridges to illustrate that a virtuous life is never without its obstacles. But I'm on the path of vice, where visitors get titillation alongside moral instruction. One of the stopping off points is the Temple of Venus.
The book tells me that the paintings in here tell the story of this lady who runs away from her disagreeable husband and goes instead to revel with a beastly herd of satyrs, these famously lascivious creatures. So it's basically a temple to naughty women. But we're still in the vice area of the garden, don't forget, so we know not to follow their example. Let's go on improving our characters somewhere else.
But Cobham intended his garden to offer something more than just moral instruction. Stowe also reads like a political pamphlet, Cobham's own State of the Nation address. And some of his messages seem to be aimed directly at Frederick, Prince of Wales. Cobham and his group of opposition politicians had identified the prince as a potential leader for their cause. At the heart of the garden is the Temple of British Worthies. Here I'm meeting Richard Wheeler to find out how this pantheon of British heroes is actually an attack on George II.
Obviously, there's politics going on here. He's chosen some characters, but not others. What was he trying to express?
Well, there's a subtext going on here because he had just broken from Sir Robert Walpole's Whig party to form his own internal Whig opposition, the Whig Patriots. So we have King Alfred, the mildest justice, most beneficent of kings, everything that King George II was not. And beside him, the Black Prince, the terror of Europe, the delight of England, everything to which Prince Frederick aspired. And of course, Prince Frederick was the titular leader of the Whig opposition to Sir Robert Walpole.
Why was Cobham so much against Sir Robert Walpole?
Because he was our first Prime Minister, and the idea of a Prime Minister was deeply objectionable, that one person should rule was dictatorial, absolutist, and everything that was wrong.
So according to the guidebook, King Alfred's been picked out because he guarded liberty and he was the founder of the English Constitution. This is all significant, isn't it?
The English Constitution is probably the most significant because if anything works at Stowe, it's the idea of our old Gothic constitution deriving from the Witan, the Parliament of the Saxons. So we have Alfred here, the greatest of the Saxon kings, and on the hill behind you've got the Saxon Temple, which is otherwise known as the Temple of Liberty. So it's all anti-autocracy, and the main point of which was that Parliament chose the king, as it did in Saxon times. And I think a lot of this is instruction for Prince Frederick, telling him how to behave if he's going to be a patriot king. One has to remember that Lord Cobham and all his compatriots were the ones who brought the Hanoverians over, but they've got to remain under control.
Yes.
So it's the Whig oligarchy who are actually running the country, and the king as a constitutional monarch. So the idea of the constitution, really important, and the king really doing what he was told.
And guess what? There's no Germans here at all.
No, they're all over the other side of the garden, in the Garden of Vice. I don't quite know why, but there it is.
None of this was lost on Frederick, who would commission an opera in honour of Alfred, the great patriot king. Frederick was emerging as the leader of the opposition. So his parents tried to rein him in by suppressing his allowance. The simplest way for a prince to up his income was to get married, but George and Caroline had deliberately put off finding their son a wife. Poor Fred was left on the shelf until he was almost 30. In April 1736, his parents finally relented. The German princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha became Frederick's wife.
Luckily for Augusta, Frederick liked his princess bride and got his pay rise. But he was disappointed when it turned out to be only £50,000 a year, half of what he'd been expecting. Now there was open conflict between the prince and his parents. This was the beginning of an annus horribilis for the Georgian monarchy.
And when the king left for Germany, yet again, his courtiers felt the force of public opinion.
People got so fed up with George constantly going off to Hanover that a mysterious spoof notice appeared, stuck to the gates of St. James's Palace. It read, "Lost or strayed out of this house, a man who has abandoned a wife and 6 children." A reward was offered for information of 4 shillings and 6pence, but you weren't to expect any more money than that, nobody judging him to deserve a crown.
And Prince Frederick's camp were furious that he hadn't been made regent. Caroline was once again running the show, and she was back in full social reformer mode. Once her target had been smallpox, but she now wanted to clamp down on a new blight sweeping London, the craze for gin.
Londoners thought that if beer came by the pint, so too should this new drink called gin. By the 1730s, they were addicted to gin. They were drinking 2 pints per head per week. His Majesty's government decided to reduce gin consumption by increasing the price. They put a big new tax on gin. This went down very badly with Londoners. There were riots about the gin tax. Liquor shops were draped in black to mourn the death of gin drinking. And there was an ominous new chant amongst the crowds on the street. They went, "No gin, no king. No gin, no king." What did Prince Frederick do to calm down the situation? Well, nothing at all. In fact, he inflamed it. He was seen going to a tavern and drinking a glass of gin. And by doing this, he was saying, "I'm just like you. I like gin, and I don't like the king."
Frederick's ingratiating ways incensed Caroline. "My God," she said, "popularity always makes me sick, but Fred's popularity makes me vomit." A storm was brewing. In December 1736, King George was returning from Hanover when his ship was caught in a violent gale. Rumours reached London that he'd been lost at sea. Caroline was distraught and also disgusted at Prince Frederick, who was clearly relishing the prospect of becoming king himself. For a week, the country held its breath. Many were wishing that the king had drowned, but finally news arrived that he was safe and well. Back in London, George II now had to deal with his upstart son and mounting political opposition. One of the best mouthpieces for dissident voices was the theatre, perhaps the most subversive art form in Georgian Britain. Not surprisingly, Prince Frederick had already associated himself with the stage. He had written his own comedy, The Modish Couple. Here at the Bristol Old Vic, an original Georgian theatre, its artistic director Tom Morris can explain how the stage provided a platform for mocking the ruling order.
We're standing on a stage here. It's not the way people think of a modern theatre. We're not kind of shut away from the audience somewhere up there. We're surrounded by them. And what's more, it's manifest in the architecture of the building that different members of the audience will have a different point of view. Someone sitting over there will necessarily have a different point of view of this conversation than someone sitting over there. It's like a reverse shot.
If, as an actor, then, that person is booing and
Yeah.
that person is cheering, can you sort of shut them out and go with them?
Absolutely. And we know that there were asides in Georgian theatre. If you play an aside in a theatre like this, you choose who you play it to and you choose who you don't play it to.
Oh, right.
So,
Yes.
so you can constantly manipulate the relationship with the audience.
When you look at 18th century plays, they appear to be incredibly naughty. They're always satirical, they're always causing trouble, they seem to be against power and authority.
Yeah, I mean, Tom Thumb, which is a pretty tough read, I have to say, is largely a sequence of knob jokes about Robert Walpole, which obviously he hated. Now, if you read the script, he's not going to say that, he can't quite say that, because it's all negotiated live with sort of double entendre in this kind of theatre, where something can be implied, a joke aimed here can be shared to the exclusion of those people, and meanings are kind of fluid, immediate, and transitory. And that makes it very threatening politically.
In 1737, Sir Robert Walpole would try to bring the curtain down on seditious theatres, citing a play that mysteriously hasn't survived, The Golden Rump. The details of the play itself are a bit mysterious, but you can get a hint of what it was about from this contemporary print called The Festival of the Golden Rump. The focus of the scene is the king's bottom. And this itself was the focus of Georgian society because of a habit the king had of turning his back on people who were out of favour at court. If the king didn't want to speak to you, he would turn around and show you his backside, a technique that everybody called rumping. Also, everybody knew that part of the reason the king had such a bad temper was because he suffered terribly from the hemorrhoids. In this print, the king is shown as a satyr, a creature that's out of control, and it's lashing out. In this case, the satyr is kicking a magician-like figure who represents Sir Robert Walpole. But don't worry, sensible Queen Caroline is here, the mistress of medicine. She's going to bring the king back under her control by giving him an enema. She's injecting a magic potion up the royal bum. It's quite amusing to think that this play was only performed in public in the House of Commons. What happened was that Sir Robert Walpole claimed he'd been given a manuscript version of it, and in order to show how offensive and scandalous it was, he read it out in Parliament. Of course, everybody went, "This is terrible, we can't have this." From now on, there would only be 2 licensed theatres in London. And all new plays had to be vetted by the Lord Chamberlain. But there's a very attractive conspiracy theory here. I like this one. The idea is that perhaps Sir Robert Walpole cooked the whole thing up himself. Perhaps he commissioned the scandalous play in order to create the outrage and to get his censorship law passed. In February 1737, Frederick took the feud with his father right into Parliament. His supporters backed a motion to get the prince's allowance increased. Frederick's side lost by only a few votes. This was the most public affront yet, by the prince to the king. And to make matters worse, Frederick and his wife Augusta had moved into Kensington Palace, where Frederick's habits quickly began to grate on his mother. The palace was so claustrophobic that Caroline had to come out into the gardens to get a bit of privacy. She loved walking. She'd clack along in her slippers with red heels. Other times, though, she was trapped indoors,
Once she was looking out of the window and she saw Frederick crossing the courtyard beneath her, and she was heard to say, "There he goes, that monster! How I wish that a hole from hell would open up and swallow him."
In July 1737, this feud finally came to a head. The royal family had assembled at Hampton Court to witness the arrival of Frederick and Augusta's first child. But Frederick was determined to keep his parents away from the birth.
Augusta's labour pains began in the middle of the night. Now you'd expect them to call the midwife and keep her in bed. But no, her husband Frederick made her get up, he made her walk downstairs, and he bundled her into a carriage to drive 15 miles through the night to St. James's Palace. Now, poor Augusta was a teenager. She was in a foreign land. This was her first pregnancy, and she spent her first labour in a bumpy carriage in the middle of the night. This was terribly cruel behaviour on Frederick's part. Augusta was writhing about in agony, and Frederick held her down with his weight. He used so much force that he later said he'd put his back out doing it. When they arrived at St. James's Palace, they weren't expected, so nothing was ready for them. There weren't even any sheets for the bed. And when the little baby girl was eventually born, they had to wrap her up in a table napkin. Frederick was successful in tricking his parents out of their privilege of being present at the birth of their grandchild. When Caroline heard what had happened, she too got up in the middle of the night and came dashing to St. James's Palace, but she was too late. The baby was already born. The next day, there was an almighty bust-up, and everybody knew about it. It got into the newspapers. This was a very dangerous moment for the Hanoverian monarchy. Both sides were damaged. George II looked like he couldn't even control his own family. And as for Frederick, he looked irresponsible. He'd risked the life of his wife. How could he be trusted with the future of the nation when the time came? And worst of all, there was no prospect of reconciliation. This quarrel looked set to continue to the grave.
It would take just that, a death, to make the royal family and the country take stock. In November 1737, in her brand new library at St. James's Palace, Caroline was suddenly stricken with intense pain.
What was actually wrong with Caroline? Well, nobody knew. The doctors weren't allowed to examine her body. There was a sense that this would have been undignified, and also an idea that queens weren't really made out of flesh and blood, that they were never ill. But poor Caroline was clearly in agony. She was put to bed, and eventually the king insisted that the doctors have a look at her stomach. And then they discovered that ever since the birth of her last child, Caroline had been suffering in secret from an umbilical hernia. This is when a hole opens up in the walls of the stomach. It's terribly painful. Caroline had come to her crisis because a little loop of her bowels had popped out through that hole. What the doctors should have done is get the bowels, push them back in, and sew up the hole. That's what they would do today. But Caroline's doctors made a terrible mistake. That little loop of bowels, they cut it off.
Throughout all of this, Caroline kept up her good spirits. When the doctor came in to operate, she encouraged him by saying, "Dr. Ranby, just pretend you're cutting up your ex-wife." Her only concern seemed to be for the grief of her husband and her children. George II now devoted himself to her care. He sat by the bed in tears. And when she was at death's door, they had this very famous conversation. She said to him, "I want you to be happy, marry again after I'm gone." But he said, "No, I will have mistresses,
and the implication was that the mistresses had meant nothing to him. He would never have a second queen. And when she died, it was with her hand in his. And where was Prince Frederick? Despite the estrangement, he had asked to come to his mother's bedside, but the king had forbidden it. Frederick, he said, shall not come and act any of his silly plays here. When Caroline had heard this, she'd deferred to her husband. But later, she sent a private message of blessing and forgiveness to her son. A piece of street poetry summed up the public reaction. Death, where is thy sting? To take the queen and leave the king. And what of the king?
Here is sad and lonely George, all by himself, missing his wife. He's gone to her library to have a look at the bust of her over the door. This was a real low point for George II. Not only had he lost his companion of 30 years, he'd also lost an important political ally. She had been the friendly face of his regime.
He would eventually recover, and, old soldier as he was, go on to enjoy military victories over the French and the Scots. This period saw the development of a well-informed and pugnacious public, a new force that challenged the old elite. The world had changed, and sooner or later every monarchy across Europe would have to come to terms with it.
If you were an 18th century king or queen, you had two choices here. Either you could ignore all of this and hope that it went away. That's what they did in France, and look what happened to them. Or you could subtly change the way in which you went about being a monarch. And in Britain, it was Queen Caroline and Prince Frederick who really understood this, so much so that I think they rather overshadowed George II.
Caroline had tried to help the British, promoting science and philosophy and social improvement. And Frederick had embraced the people, placing himself amongst the crowd rather than above it.
They somehow knew how to ease the friction between the monarchy and the people. And I think we can judge their success by the fact that 300 years later, their descendants are still on the throne.
Next time, as Britain seeks to rule the waves, King George's love of fighting helps him overcome the death of his queen, renewing his sense of kingship as he leads his troops into battle.
Now, boys, he said, fire and be brave, and the French will soon run.
In 1743, King George II became the last British king ever to lead his troops in person on the battlefield.
Now, boys, he said, fire and be brave, and the French will soon run.
The battle was Dettingen, here in Germany, and the enemy was Britain's old adversary, France. George had reached the ripe old age of 59. Some of the British thought that the ageing king's military enthusiasm had got the better of him.
But when they tried to shuffle the king off the battlefield for his own safety, he said, "Don't tell me of danger, I'll be even with them." Now, George II was undeniably brave, but was he really acting in the best interests of Britain?
German George II was a warrior king. He was using the power of Britain to protect his other realm, his native Hanover. But the British were more interested in ruling the waves than fighting continental wars. For this series, I've been given access to the Royal Collection, as pieces are brought together for an exhibition about the first Georgian kings at the Queen's Gallery, Buckingham Palace. This was a new dynasty who found themselves fighting the French, the Jacobites, and each other all at the same time. It's remarkable that these Hanoverian kings didn't weaken the monarchy, they strengthened it. They helped transform Britain into a global superpower.
What was George II doing on this foreign battlefield? This is exactly where his artillery was positioned. Well, this was part of the War of the Austrian Succession. It was a gallant cause. It was the defence of the right of Maria Theresa of Austria to inherit her father's throne, even though she was a woman.
But George had ulterior motives. He wanted to contain the French threat and protect the interests of Hanover's near neighbour, Austria.
Although he was nearly 60, George II was determined to lead from the front. A cannonball went whizzing within half a yard of his head, and his son, the Duke of Cumberland, got shot in the leg. But despite these close brushes with death, the battle was a success.
You'd think that George II would be riding high after thrashing the French, but some of his British subjects weren't happy. On the battlefield of Dettingen, George had worn the yellow sash of Hanover. All the king's enemies at home seized upon the fact that he charged into battle wearing Hanoverian colours, not British. Some people went so far as to say that George was defending Hanover with the blood of proud Englishmen. It became such a PR problem that when this portrait was painted, George was portrayed wearing a sash that was tactfully and Britishly blue. Unsurprisingly, George's opponents sought to capitalise on this controversy.
On the one side were the king's own supporters who wanted to defend the White Horse of Hanover. This lot wanted a strong British army to get involved in continental wars to protect Hanover's interests. On the other hand, though, we have the Patriots, represented by the British Lion. This lot thought that Hanover was a chink in Britain's defences. Forget Hanover, they said. Britain is an island nation defended by the sea.
The Patriots were a charismatic group of politicians and poets. They counted both Whigs and Tories among their number. They were the original Eurosceptics. The Patriots believed Britain should go it alone, ignore continental disputes, build a strong navy, and gain more colonies in America and round the world. This was the way, they argued, for Britain to secure international dominance.
Now, this lot needed a leader, and they settled upon the king's eldest son, Prince Frederick, who by this point had become something of a professional activist.
George II had always considered his eldest son, Frederick, to be the black sheep of the family. As people said, it ran in the blood of these Georgian monarchs to hate their eldest son. George II and Frederick had always had their petty feuds and squabbles, but now the king was really worried. Frederick was gaining political momentum. In 1740, Frederick was the inspiration for a new song that was to be the theme tune for these rebellious patriots.
Ready?
It was so scandalous that it had to be performed privately. So you might be surprised to learn that you know it already. Today, people sing Rule Britannia on the last night of the proms as a cheery celebration of Britishness. But this song was in fact an open revolt against King George II, as I suggested to the historian Dr. Oliver Cox.
I mean, when it's first performed, it's a royal revolt. It's a song for a prince against his father and against his father's Prime Minister. Rule Britannia as we sing it now is Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. It's a statement of present fact. When it's first performed in 1740, it's rule the waves. It's a command. It's an expectation that if we follow the Patriots' policies, Britain will rule the waves.
The song goes on and on and on about this concept of liberty. What does that mean in the 18th century?
One of the problems with the 1730s, as far as the Patriots are concerned, is the liberty to choose their own representatives in Parliament, the liberty to be protected from external invaders, the liberty to trade as they want to, is threatened and endangered. And what the Patriots thought needed to happen was an emphasis on English liberty, the navy, and trade. You've got these three important tenets that really bind everything that they say together.
Frederick obviously is born and grows up in Hanover. He's the family's main representative there for the first part of his life. But then later on he becomes awfully English, doesn't he?
Yeah, he sort of rebrands himself. And whether it's a clever piece of sort of opportunistic politicking in the sense that by acting far more English, he's able to bring in a sort of disparate group of the disaffected politicians and poets who may one day be able to help him conceive of a coherence of opposition policy to his father.
Does he do all this then just to annoy his dad?
I think a lot of the difficulties and the issues that we see throughout the 1730s and 1740s is Frederick, you know, sticking his middle finger up at his dad.
Frederick was the king in waiting, and he was frankly getting impatient for power. He now had his own rival court, and he began to tussle with his father George II over foreign policy and how best to tackle the French threat. Patriot William Pitt was just one politician who fought for Frederick's manifesto in Parliament. He felt that the electorate of Hanover was Britain's weak link.
Pitt was a notoriously good orator. This is one wonderful speech that he made in the Houses of Parliament, complaining that the Hanoverian tail was wagging the British dog. Britain, he said, this great, this powerful, this formidable country is treated merely as the province of a despicable electorate. Clearly, this wasn't going to win him any favours with George II, and throughout the 1740s, Pitt was a lone voice in the wilderness, like Churchill before World War II. He was calling for more British self-confidence and aggression towards France, the seizing of French colonies in America, but nobody was listening.
Pitt was right. The French were always looking for ways to destabilise Britain, and so they conspired with Jacobite plotters. George II's exiled rival, the pretender James Stuart, had a good blood claim to the British crown. But he'd been excluded for his Catholicism. This would-be King James III and his Jacobite supporters had been twiddling their thumbs in exile in Rome. But the French now threw them a lifeline: military backing to attempt a coup in Britain. On the 23rd of July, 1745, James III's son, Charles Edward Stuart, landed on the coast of Scotland and sounded the rallying cry. Charles, who was basically an Italian, was here to challenge George, a German, to the British throne. And here at the palace of Holyrood House is the man of the hour. Prince Charles Edward Stuart, aka the Young Pretender.
Charles Stuart had been brought up in Rome, and he'd always been told that the British throne was rightfully his, if only he could go out and get it. This portrait is like a recruiting poster for the prince's supporters. He's saying here, your prince needs you. And what a dashing and handsome young prince he is. He's looking very martial in his armour. He's looking very official and respectable in his blue sash of the Order of the Garter. But on top of that, he's wearing the green ribbon with the Cross of St. Andrews of the Order of the Thistle, the Scottish order. And this is designed to appeal to his richest source of potential support, the Scots.
The Stuarts had been Scottish kings long before they'd inherited the English throne in the 17th century. And many Scots, particularly in the Highlands, rallied to Charles Stuart's cause. George II's popularity was at a low point. His decision to go on fighting that war with the Austrian succession was seen as a pointless drain on British resources. It was mainly the old Protestant dislike and mistrust of Catholicism that was keeping King George II on the throne and the exiled Stuarts off it. Edinburgh should have been a stronghold for George II, but with a sword in one hand and a cross in the other, the Young Pretender simply strolled with his forces into the Scottish capital and took control.
He got a riotous reception, particularly from two sections of the crowd. Firstly, the so-called common people, and secondly, the ladies. All the women got out their handkerchiefs and threw them into the street in front of him. And it was on this occasion that a new nickname was heard for Charles Stuart. People were shouting out for Bonnie Prince Charlie.
By now, Charles Stuart had got together an army of between 11,000 and 14,000 troops. His advisors encouraged him to seize the hour, to march on London to take the big prize, the British throne.
Charles Stuart set up government here at the Palace of Holyrood House for 5 weeks. While he was here, he issued the Declaration of King James on behalf of his exiled father. This declaration appealed very cleverly to the self-interest of the British. It said that their German kings had been involving them in irrelevant foreign wars, wasting their resources, disrupting trade, and anyway, nobody wants to be ruled by a foreigner. You can see how this touched a nerve amongst Prince Frederick's group of patriots.
Charles Stuart was being rather clever here. He knew that running down Hanover would appeal to the British public. Indeed, Sir Robert Walpole, when he was Prime Minister, had remarked that they would have been better off making Charles Stuart Elector of Hanover, because the public will never fetch another king from there. During the weeks of Charles Stuart's advance south into England, tensions mounted in the Georgian court. George II, bursting for a fight as usual, was ready to get on his horse and lead the charge. Instead, though, his younger son, the rotund Duke of Cumberland, was hurriedly brought back from the war with the Austrian succession and sent north to face the Jacobite threat.
There was no love lost between the sons of George II. That's Frederick, the Prince of Wales, and his younger brother, the Duke of Cumberland. They really were chalk and cheese. Frederick was thin and liked music, whereas Cumberland was as fat as a Cumberland sausage, and he was a career soldier. Frederick was right to worry about the threat his younger brother represented. George II had even talked about a plan where Frederick would be shuffled out of the line of succession and given Hanover as a consolation prize, and the crown of Great Britain would be placed firmly on the head of the king's favourite son, Cumberland, instead.
Cumberland now marched north for a showdown with the Jacobite army at Carlisle Castle. Meanwhile, his brother Frederick had Carlisle Castle recreated in spun sugar for a rather quirky dinner party rebellion.
The Duke of Cumberland had liberated the city of Carlisle from the Jacobites. But Frederick wasn't very impressed by this. He decided to make a mockery out of it. One day for dessert, he ordered a model of the citadel of Carlisle to be made out of sugar. And after dinner, he bombarded it with sugar plums. Now, this must have been quite hilarious for Frederick's guests, and it may seem a little bit trivial. But actually, members of the royal family couldn't come right out and openly criticise each other. They had to express their opinions obliquely. And that's why their politics could be expressed through things like their puddings.
Frederick was also making a bigger humanitarian point. He was a gentler character than his brother and abhorred Cumberland's brutal approach to warfare. As Charles Stuart and the Jacobites retreated back north into Scotland, the Duke of Cumberland was beginning to pursue them with real ferocity. The struggle for the British throne came to a head here at Culloden, a battlefield that would become a byword for cruelty and bloodshed. This was the last battle ever to be fought on British soil. It was to be decided by two men in their 20s. Bonnie Prince Charlie was 25, and Cumberland's 25th birthday was the day before the battle. Kate Hurd, Royal Collection Trust's Senior Curator of Prints and Drawings, believes this watercolour is the closest we have to a visual first-hand account of Culloden.
This picture sort of takes us to a ringside seat at the battle, doesn't it? How was the artist able to do that?
We know that the artist was at the battle. He was working for the Duke of Cumberland as one of his draftsmen and surveyors, so we know that he was an eyewitness to the battle.
Well, it looks like this side are winning because they're always all coming forwards, but that's not actually what's happening, is it?
No, you're absolutely right in that they are appearing to advance. They are advancing. It's the Jacobite troops on the right. They are doing this Highland Charge, which is their characteristic means of fighting. And it had been very successful for them. They'd won the Battle of Prestonpans just earlier in the same manner. But what they are facing is devastating fire from the government troops.
They've got better guns.
They've got better guns, and they've loaded them with canister shot, which scatters shot across the field.
There's the Duke of Cumberland sitting there watching. Was he a good commander, do you think?
He had a lot to prove at this point. He'd recently suffered a really humiliating defeat against the French on the continent at the Battle of Fontenoy, and he'd come to deal with the Jacobite threat. We know that he sent spies to the Jacobite camp the night before, so he was forewarned of what was about to happen. And he also had the advantage in that the Jacobites had attempted a night raid which had failed, so the soldiers were tired in a way that his soldiers weren't.
It's very distressing, actually, because you've got all of these poor Highlanders running forwards with what looks like a pitchfork in his hand, and these guys are just shooting cannons at them.
It was clearly a horrific battle, a great sort of toll.
But there was another factor in the fall of the Jacobites. They'd been abandoned by their French allies. Things were now going well for the French on the continent. They no longer needed to employ diversionary tactics in Scotland. I met Dr. Tony Pollard, a battlefield historian, who believes that Bonnie Prince Charlie didn't have any choice but to turn and face Cumberland's forces.
Tony, why did Bonnie Prince Charlie have to stand and fight here, or why did he feel that he had to?
There are a number of reasons, really. For the Jacobites, it's a last roll of the dice, and the option is either to fight here or disappear. into the mountains and basically fight a guerrilla war.
Wouldn't they have been really good at that?
I'm sure they would have been, given the Highland backbone to the army. But the thing is that Charles is a prince, and princes do not fight guerrilla wars.
It's a matter of masculine pride.
There's very much a matter of pride.
So, Bonnie Prince Charlie has his last great gamble. It fails. Just how bad was the defeat?
For him personally, it seems to have been catastrophic. He can't deal with the fact that this was it. But there are still men out there desperate to continue the fight, but he doesn't want to. And he disappears off into the heather famously. And so the Jacobite cause bleeds to death on Culloden Moor.
What sort of reprisals did Cumberland start to take then? This is where things get very nasty.
Almost as soon as the gunsmoke has cleared, the reprisals on the field begin. And wounded Jacobites are executed, men are taken away and imprisoned temporarily, then executed. Civilians are kept away from the battlefield. So it beggars belief what might have gone on here.
Now, some people have used the words ethnic cleansing to talk about these atrocities. Do you think that that's fair?
Very much so. There is a concerted campaign, particularly in the Highlands, basically to wreak havoc and to take revenge. And there are some terrible stories. And Cumberland himself, at one point, wanted to exile most of the population of the Highlands to the Americas so they couldn't cause more trouble. So it's an understandable response to these events.
Mass killings and mass graves. Unspeakable atrocities were witnessed at Culloden. And in Scotland, the Duke is still known as Butcher Cumberland. Back in London, though, he was feted as the man who'd saved Britain. Handel's oratorio, Judas Maccabeus, including the words, "See the conquering hero comes," was composed in his honour and rang out at St. Paul's Cathedral. King George II had finally vanquished the Stuart threat. A visitor to his crowded court reported, "I never saw anyone in such glee as the king." You could also buy a little bit of the Hanoverian victory to take home with you in the form of these commemorative medals in gold or silver celebrating the Duke of Cumberland. And this is such a divisive image, isn't it? To the Hanoverian supporters in London, they would have seen here a conquering hero, a fine figure of a man. But if you show this image of the Duke with his jowls to a Scottish person, even today, they're likely to spit on it. And the Hanoverians weren't done with the Highlanders yet. George II got Parliament to pass the Dress Act that made it illegal to wear tartan and banned the bagpipes. Frederick disagreed with this heavy-handed treatment, but again he displayed his rebellion in quite a cunning way. He commissioned a painting of his son, the future George III, containing a coded message.
People at the time thought that there was something very strange about this picture. It was painted only months after the Battle of Culloden, and yet the little boy is wearing tartan. This could have been family politics. This is Frederick and his children having a go at Frederick's brother, the Duke of Cumberland, the victor of Culloden. Maybe Frederick is saying, I have some sympathy for the vanquished Jacobites. And I'd like to think that this is Frederick trying to assimilate the style of the Scots back into Great Britain. It would eventually work very well. Tartan would become a symbol of romanticism rather than rebellion.
Myth and romance swirl around our image of the brave Scots with their pitchforks being cut down by a high-tech army. In reality, though, Scotland was just as sophisticated a society as England. The Jacobites may have been in love with the past, wanting to turn back time to the days when kings had divine right. But Scotland also boasted more progressive people, such as a group of new thinkers who were much more interested in shaping the future, the men of the Scottish Enlightenment. From poetry to pathology, Enlightenment thinking flowed out into all sorts of channels, including architecture. Those behind it thought that their future lay within the Union. So a competition to create a whole new quarter of Edinburgh was won by a design that featured a Union flag. George Street links the grand thoroughfares of Hanover Street and Frederick Street. But just why did the Scottish capital teem with innovation?
The answer was education, and education, and education. By 1750, the Scots were the most literate nation in Europe. 75% of them knew how to read. And they also had 5 universities, as opposed to just 2 in England. At the Scottish universities, the fees were relatively low, and the social mix was relatively broad. Scottish people liked to joke that there were the same number of universities in the whole of England as there were in just the city of Aberdeen.
There was also a practical bent to education in Scotland. Poor but ambitious Scots, armed with useful skills, found plenty of opportunity abroad, in Britain's trade networks and new colonies. The Scots had failed to beat the English, so now it seemed like time to join them and make a profit. Professor Tom Devine believes that while the English ruled Britain's colonies, the Scots actually ran them.
What were the practical effects of the Scottish Enlightenment when these well-educated Scottish people were going abroad to sort of practice it in other countries?
The impact is significant across the Atlantic in the mid to late 18th century period, because these new colonies, the North American colonies, what became the USA, is looking for ideas. It's looking, for example, it's looking for a kind of intellectual toolkit, you know, from European thinking in order to build up its institutions virtually from scratch, and to a significant degree it gets them from Scotia. The most remarkable example was what was called the College of New Jersey, better known now as Princeton. Princeton was the seminary for the first generation of statesmen in the USA, and Princeton's president was John Witherspoon, a Scottish cleric of the Enlightenment period.
Do you think it's fair to say that the Scottish Enlightenment was a sort of engine driving the expansion of the British Empire?
Well, it certainly was in terms of thinking, and it certainly was in terms of the tremendous regard that during the Enlightenment Scotland developed for almost a reverence for learning. And that was very important, because not all immigrants into the empire in this period were literate. Scots had this particular advantage of literacy and numeracy. I mean, don't forget, you get Scottish stereotypes aplenty. The Scottish doctor, the Scottish physician, the Scottish engineer. Beam me up, Scotty.
So you've got these intelligent, well-educated, rational, commercially successful Scots.
And greedy.
But they're not making their own society fairer. Oh no, they're going off across the world to get rich elsewhere.
But it's important to recognise that among this range of influences, if you like, the intellectual engine of Enlightenment, I would argue the primary engine is materialistic. That the reason why Scottish doctors went in their large numbers to the Caribbean was not simply to study disease or to provide support or healing. It was to make lots and lots of filthy lucre.
One settlement that provided these kinds of opportunities was the new American colony of Georgia, named after King George II. In exchange for bringing education to the Native American population, Britain gained fertile territory for growing new empire products like tobacco. In 1734, the kings of this new world came to pay their respects to the King of the Old.
A party of chiefs from the Cherokee Nation came here to this room in Kensington Palace to pay their respects to the King of Britain. Their leader was called Tomochichi. He came with his war captains, and their faces were painted in red and black. The British thought it looked like they were wearing masks. As part of the welcome ceremony, Tomochichi was introduced to the ladies of the British court, and he was asked to judge which of them he thought was the most beautiful. Tomochichi gave what I think is a very diplomatic answer. He said, "I can't possibly tell, because all you white folk look the same to me."
The race was on to colonise the New World. And again, George II's Scottish subjects were helping to win it. Protecting Georgia's lucrative frontier lands against the Spanish in Florida and the French in the Alabama Basin were Scottish Highlanders who'd emigrated as soldier settlers. One of the first towns they founded was New Inverness, named after the home they'd left behind. Transporting the products of the empire safely back to Britain was not without risk. Vessels faced the hazards of piracy and shipwreck. Prince Frederick, still banging his patriot drum, believed that a strong navy to protect the trade routes was vital, and he said so on a visit to Bristol.
When Frederick was entertained here at the Merchants' Hall, it was very lavishly, with 100 dishes on the table, and he was mobbed by the wives of 500 merchants. He made a speech that was all about the importance of the navy to protect the ships of all of these people carrying their cotton and their sugar. And this went down very well, as you might expect. He finished with a few rousing words on the importance of the advancement of trade, which has a valuable effect on the liberty and happiness of our nation. Cheers.
All sorts of new empire goods were now available in Britain, and keen consumers were to be found in the growing middling rank of society. Crucially, the Georgians now had a reliable system of credit. You could order goods now and pay for them later.
People could now buy not only what they needed, but what they wanted. The British went mad for the so-called empire products, tea from China and textiles from India. And they also loved the 18th century phenomenon known as the toy shop. We're not talking here about toys for kids, but for adults, little knickknacks and table decorations, that sort of thing. Dr. Johnson defined a toy as something for show rather than use, a petty commodity, a trifle.
It was during this era that luxury became something of a buzzword. Paul Bertrand ran a fashionable toy shop for adults in Westminster, where Frederick, Prince of Wales, extravagantly spent over £700 in a single visit on knickknacks. His purchases ranged from a silver corkscrew to a selection of antique porcelain. Frederick was desperate to look up to date because for the first time, the royal court was not associated with all that was fashionable. You can see this in a very striking way if you look at what women were wearing at court. One of the most incredible dresses to have survived from the Georgian period is the Rockingham Mantua. Joanna Marshner, curator of the Royal Ceremonial Dress Collection, believes that this glittering relic was a fabulous creation, yes, but out of step with modern society.
So, Joanna, this is a dress fit to be worn at the Georgian court.
You can just see this is the flashiest dress that you can even begin to imagine. And it was really, really expensive. It is made out of the most precious textile. It's called an orris tissue, woven with real silver.
There was something a bit uniform-like about it too, wasn't there? You had to wear something like this if you were going to appear at court.
The absolute courtly giveaway is that you wore it with a petticoat, and the petticoat stemmed out from here, and you can do the same thing on the other side, and it is enormous. Sort of big. It would have come down like this, and it stood out like a piece of pasteboard. It really was a bit like a billboard.
This gives a sense of how impractically vast it is, doesn't it? It must have been pretty difficult to walk in, but that's sort of the point of this type of dress, isn't it?
This is a style of dress for a person who will go to one of these lovely gatherings, and you would have stood there just looking glamorous and glorious. And as this style falls away in fashionable circles, in the court it gets ever more entrenched.
Now, yes, these dresses are spectacular and they're otherworldly, but as the reign of George II goes on, they're getting increasingly out of step with contemporary society. At court, they're still wearing a type of dress that had been fashionable in the real world 60 years before. And there's a brilliant description from the very late Georgian period of an elderly court beauty going to the palace in one of these dresses, wearing a bit too much makeup. She's travelling by sedan chair, and through its glass window, she looks like a specimen from a natural history collection. She looks like the fetus of a hippopotamus pickled in a bottle of brandy. The court was turning into an outsized bauble. Ornamentally important, yet increasingly separate from the serious business of getting ahead. The drivers of taste were now the merchants, the middling sort. And they had a fresh passion, the novel. The 18th century saw the birth of this new literary genre, which was driven by a growing and increasingly literate middle rank in society. But many novelists were keen on attacking the luxury enjoyed by their readers. They believed that empire products were corrupting the British.
One of the most vociferous critics of luxury was the Scottish writer Tobias Smollett. In this novel, Humphrey Clinker, there's a sort of an anti-hero called Matthew Bramble. And Matthew Bramble goes on this great voyage or adventure all around Britain, and everywhere he finds debauchery and con men and pimps, and particularly the nouveau riche. Smollett is very down on their empty glitter and glare. Now, Tobias Smollett and Matthew Bramble are practically the same person and can claim to be the original grumpy old man. Smollett had such a pessimistic and negative view of life that his rival writers called him snail fungus.
Smollett ridiculed the super-rich in their mock Palladian palaces. Behind the facades of these la-di-da Georgian townhouses, he said, lay dirty secrets. Smollett thought that Georgian cities were the grand sources of luxury and corruption, and that their inhabitants were controlled by the demons of licentiousness. Smollett was just one of many writers who revealed that the engine driving much of Britain's economic success was far less palatable than tea or sugar. Professor James Wolvin has made the slave trade his life's study. He believes that slavery seeped into every pore of Britain's emerging empire.
So how does this trade actually work? What other goods are involved?
We talk of it as a triangular trade. It's much more complex geographically than that, but nonetheless, that's the basic core of it. It's ships that leave here, Bristol, Liverpool, London, packed to the gunwales with produce from the hinterland, metal goods, but above all textiles for West Africa. And in West Africa, those goods are traded for Africans, and they're traded with other African traders. You know, Africans providing the Africans for the slave ships. And then they're shipped across in huge numbers, the largest enforced movement of people ever, to the plantations of the Americas. The last leg is the leg that brings back the produce that the slaves had grown. It's tobacco, it's sugar, It's dyestuffs, rice, which we use for starch. 18th century clothing, ladies' fashionable clothing, starched and beautiful. Where's the starch come from? It comes from rice. And who grows the rice? Africans in South Carolina.
What impact do you think that the slave trade had on Britain's economy then? Was it central to it?
Historians have been arguing about this now for 50, 60 years. How central is the slave trade in the emergence of British economy? It's very hard to pin down to numbers. The knock-on effect of the slave trade is extraordinary. Who thinks, if you're looking at small textile villages in Yorkshire, that this is somehow or other driven by the slave trade? Who thinks of the trade in textiles from India, that this has got something to do with the slave trade? But Africans in Jamaica and Barbados are clothed in cool-fitting cotton goods from Gujarat. The ramifications of it are extraordinary, not merely in Britain, but globally. You're actually looking at a form of globalization in a world that doesn't use the word.
Do you think people were aware of this sort of dirty secret behind their economic success, or was it a case of out of sight, out of mind?
The British have traditionally not thought of slavery as something that's to do with them. This is something to do with Africa or the Atlantic or the Americas. Whereas in fact, it's British ships that take them over. It's British money that makes it possible. It's Britain that profits from its from slave work. So that it's very easy to think of yourself as being committed to freedom and liberty and not remember that actually all of your material well-being is bound up with something quite different, and that is the enslavement of millions of Africans.
Britain was helped in becoming the biggest slave-trading nation in the world because it had a strong navy. Prince Frederick's supporters, singing Rule Britannia, claimed that Britons never shall be slaves. They were praising Britain's extraordinary liberties. But by policing British trade routes, the Royal Navy was helping to enslave millions of Africans. The irony was lost, not just on Frederick, but on the majority of the British people. His patriot faction had never been more influential. King George II felt that he was losing the PR battle to his son, and relations between them were as bad as ever. There was still no love lost between father and son. George II was overheard saying that he cared for his son no more than a louse, and that when Frederick succeeded, he'd ruin everything. But the king was wrong about this. When Frederick was only 44, he quite unexpectedly died. He'd been out in the rain, he caught a cold, and what actually killed him was a clot of blood on the lungs. The news reached George II one evening when he was playing at cards with a whole load of courtiers. Now they all turned to look at him, and they were closely watching him for further evidence that he'd hated his son. And they thought that they'd found it because he didn't react at all. His face was impassive. This could have been cold-heartedness, or it could have been that the king was just following rigid royal etiquette, never to express emotion in public. So we were never to have King Frederick I, described by his supporters as the greatest king we never had. Frederick had been the most popular member of the royal family. But his funeral here at Westminster Abbey was marred by disorganisation, heavy rain, and a lack of refreshments. It confirmed everything Frederick's friends believed about George II and his favouritism towards his younger son, the Duke of Cumberland. The death of his son got the king thinking about his own mortality, and he now made a new will. He designated his grandson, the future George III, as his successor. The king's first idea had been to say that his second and favourite son, the Duke of Cumberland, should be regent if necessary. But this wouldn't wash. Butcher Cumberland was just too unpopular. In fact, when Frederick died, people on the street were heard to say, "Oh, we wish it had been his brother." Frederick's death threw his patriot supporters into turmoil. Those who had hoped to rise to power in his reign were extremely disappointed. Their promised peerages had gone up in smoke. But in the wake of Frederick's death, it was his widow Augusta who reacted the most decisively.
One of the reasons that we don't fully understand the character of Prince Frederick is because his wife burnt his papers. And she did it to control his lasting reputation so that no hint of scandal would get out. I think that this shows that Augusta was quite a politically savvy person. And it also demonstrates a certain steeliness. She would now devote the rest of her life to looking after the interests of Frederick's son, and hers, the little boy who was her route to power, the future King George III.
Augusta was worried that if she antagonized King George II, he could take her son away from her, just as George I had taken Princess Caroline's children. Augusta had lost her husband. She didn't want to lose her children as well. But she knew that she had to act cleverly and with subtlety. Desmond Shaw Taylor, surveyor of the Queen's Pictures, believes that this portrait is Augusta's manifesto for becoming the matriarch of the Georgian dynasty.
What do you think Augusta's motivation was, getting all this put together?
First of all, this is a portrait of a widow painted in the same year that her husband has died. They're looking quite cheerful. And I think it's difficult immediately to understand that, except I think that the idea is that you wear a black veil, of course, for form's sake, but your duties of looking after your children and looking after the realm continue, and you might as well undertake them in a cheerful way.
Is she saying, look, he may be dead, but his work continues?
I'm sure that's exactly the message, that I'm carrying the flame.
It makes me think almost of a piece of propaganda for an election. This is the team, vote for us.
Exactly. On one side you have the role of the monarch, represented here by the late heir to the throne, Frederick Prince of Wales, and on the other side you have Britannia, that being the constitution.
And what's going on underneath Britannia? That's all very significant, isn't it?
That's the key, I think, to the entire allegory. There are some scales, and exactly balanced in the scales are the crown and the cap of liberty. The emblem of Britain, the lion, is holding another cap of liberty. So if you want to take away the liberty of the British people, you've got a lion to fight with. The mere fact of presenting the royal family in this ingratiating fashion is an expression of British liberty.
What are the significance of the activities of the children, then? They're doing things that make Britain great, aren't they?
Yes. In this era, there was a convention that naval power was protective of liberty, whereas the power of a standing army was sometimes thought to threaten liberty. So that I think it is important that they're engaged in the defense of the realm, but specifically in the naval defense of the realm.
Augusta was continuing Frederick's legacy, promoting the patriot philosophy of liberty and a strong navy, controlled here from the headquarters of the Admiralty. Britain was now the largest naval power in the world, but this was turning us into a nation greedy for territory and conquest. Our continued skirmishes with the French built towards a new and global conflict, the 7 Years' War.
Britain was empire building. We weren't content with our 13 colonies in the Americas. We wanted more. And this wasn't just a land grab, it was a war over trade and trading routes. I'm not exaggerating when I say that the question at stake here was global dominance by the British or by the French. So the fighting was played out in America, but also in Africa and India and down here in the Philippines with the Battle of Manila. Winston Churchill came up with a good name for this conflict, the 7 Years' War. He called it the First World War.
Ever the old soldier, the king went into battle mode, coordinating army tactics with his favourite lieutenant, the Duke of Cumberland. He took to shuffling around the palace in the same old coat he'd worn at the Battle of Dettingen. And he sent an army into Europe to face the French. But it went badly. George II was out of touch. Wars were no longer won by kings on horseback, leading from the front.
What was happening in Europe was a bit of a sideshow. This statue shows George II dressed as a Roman emperor. And this was the context in which he used the word empire, when he was talking about history, when he was talking about the Romans. The politician William Pitt, on the other hand, understood that Britain could aspire to have an empire in the present day. Pitt knew that what was happening in Europe was important, but it wasn't the most important thing. What was at stake was domination of the globe.
Here's William Pitt, Secretary of State. At home at Chatham House. He was to become Earl of Chatham. Never short of confidence, Pitt took military strategy firmly in hand. His opening gambit was, "I'm sure I can save this country and no one else can."
During this time, poor old William Pitt was ill, so he had to stay at home here at Chatham House. And all the great and the good came trooping up to his bedroom to discuss strategy. There's a really nice picture of William Pitt being tucked up in bed, and the room was very cold. So the Prime Minister, the Duke of Newcastle, got into another bed on the other side of the room, and together the two of them lay there, shaping British foreign policy. It was here that Pitt came up with his master stroke to use both the army and the navy. He sent the British troops to the continent to tie down the French troops, to keep them busy. And meanwhile, he sent the British Navy all around the globe, snapping up French colonies.
Oddly, it was only in the last gasp of George II's reign that these two elements, the army of the king and Frederick's navy, managed to come together to coalesce in this defining war with the French. 1759 was the year of military miracles. With the triumph of all Pitt's plans, Britain effectively became a world superpower. George II was by now deaf and blind in one eye, but the old king provided an excellent focus for national celebration in what became known as the Annus Mirabilis, the miraculous year. And yet his new empire was of little consolation to George personally.
In his youth, George II had suffered from these terrible temper tantrums. His rage had given him energy. But as time went on, his friends started to die off. His children were dying one by one, predeceasing him. As he grew older, he grew wiser and more contemplative. And ironically, this happened at the very same time that Britain grew ever more powerful and successful.
His beloved wife and 5 of his 8 children were dead. His famous military zeal was ebbing away, and he regretted his former harshness and aggression. George II's empire, as it stood, would not exist for long. A generation later, Britain would have to deal with the next conflict and the loss of America. We had denied our colonies the liberty we so highly valued, but Americans would want it badly enough to fight for it. This was a war George II would not live to see. He died on October the 25th, 1760, the last of the German-born Georgian kings, who came over from Hanover to plug Britain's dynastic gap. The king who succeeded him couldn't have been more different. George II's grandson, George III, would reject everything his grandfather stood for, to become the patriotic British king his own father, Frederick, had never had the chance to be.
This coach was designed for the coronation of George III, but unfortunately it's so fancy that it wasn't finished in time. It has been used at every coronation since. It weighs 4 tons and it takes 8 horses to pull it. But it isn't just a vehicle. It's also a sort of rolling manifesto for the British monarchy.
George III's coach in the Royal Mews at Buckingham Palace depicts Britain's naval victories at the precise moment of her greatest triumph, in the 7 Years' War. If you want to see what ruling the waves looks like, here it is in all of its gilded glory. Even Neptune and his 4 Tritons are on the side of the British.
By the time we get to George III, the process of transplantation from Hanover to Britain is pretty much complete. And George III emphasised this. In his first public speech, he distanced himself from his father and his grandfather. "I was born and educated in this country," he said. "I glory in the name of Britain."
Beyond all the bling and the bombast, this royal coach was saying that Britain's new king belonged to a confident and deep-rooted royal dynasty. The Hanoverians had seen off every single threat to their survival.
The Georgian kings were like successful stepfathers to the nation. They'd been brought in and grafted on, and yet people began to accept them as part of the family because of their killer advantages, their Protestantism, and the support of Parliament. People today often overlook the first 2 Georges, but actually they were pretty successful as rulers. Under them, Britain went from being a bit of a provincial backwater to a global superpower. And this coach stands for Britain's self-confidence in 1760. The Hanoverian dynasty was now secure. But isn't it funny to think that the British monarchy was made in Germany?